ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः
Administration in the new colonies demanded more attention and regulation than could be provided by the administrative machinery at hand. The functions of this new tribunal, if it may be designated as such at this time, do not seem to have been clearly expressed at first, at least by any law or decree now at hand, but it appears that they were advisory rather than administrative. It soon became evident that a distinction had to be made between the prerogatives of this council and those of the Casa de Contratación. During the early history of these two tribunals, there was considerable conflict of jurisdiction between them. It is probable that until the reform of August 4, 1524, was promulgated, active supervision of colonial affairs was maintained by the Council of Castile, both the Casa de Contratación and this new tribunal of the Indies acting under its direction. Charles V gave new life to the Tribunal of the Indies on the above date by assigning to it definite legislative and administrative powers, putting at its head Loaisa, the general of the Dominican order and his own confessor. The council was further modified by Charles V in 1542 and by Philip II in 1571 in the following terms. It is our royal will that the said council shall have the supreme jurisdiction in all our Occidental Indies, and of the affairs which result from them. And for the good government and administration of justice, it may order and make with our advice the laws, pragmatics, ordinances and provisions, general and particular, which may be required for the good of the provinces. And in the matters pertaining to the Indies, that the said our council be obeyed and respected, and that its provisions, in all, and by all be fulfilled and obeyed in all particulars. 16. The Council of the Indies, as established in 1524, consisted of a president, a high chancellor, 8 members who were lawyers, a fiscal, 2 secretaries and a lieutenant chancellor. 17. All these were required to be of noble birth and qualified by experience and ability to carry to a successful issue the high responsibilities which they were called upon to discharge. 18. Besides, there was a corps of accountants, auditors, copyists, reporters and clerks. The number of these last mentioned functionaries was enormous, especially in subsequent years, when correspondence with 12 or 13 different colonies was maintained. The Council of the Indies was the High Court of Appeal to which all cases from the colonial audiencias came for final adjudication. It was, however, not only a court of appeal in judicial matters, but also a directive ministry for the supervision of the administrative acts of the colonial audiencias and executives. The unqualified success of the Audiencia of Santo Domingo, both as a tribunal of justice and as an administrative organ, led to the general establishment of the institution throughout the Spanish colonial empire. The audiencias which were created in Spain's colonies from 1526 to 1893 follow in the order of their establishment. 19. Santo Domingo, created September 14, 1526, consisting of a president, 4 oidores, 20, and a fiscal. Mexico, 21, created November 29, 1527, consisting of 2 chambers, or salas, a criminal and a civil, a president, 8 oidores, 4 alcaldes del crimen, and 2 fiscales for civil and criminal cases respectively. Panama, created February 30, 1535, with a president, 4 oidores, and a fiscal. Lima, created November 20, 1542, with 2 chambers, a civil and a criminal, a president, 8 oidores, 4 criminal alcaldes, and 2 fiscales, as in Mexico. Santiago de Guatemala, created September 13, 1543, with a president, 5 oidores, and a fiscal. Guadalajara, created February 15, 1548, with a president, 4 oidores, and a fiscal. Santa Fe, New Granada, created July 17, 1549, with a president, 4 oidores, and a fiscal. La Plata, Charcas, created September 4, 1559, with a president, 5 oidores, and a fiscal. San Francisco de Quito, created November 29, 1563, with a president, 4 oidores, and a fiscal. Manila, created May 5, 1583, with a president, 4 oidores, and a fiscal. Santiago de Chile, created February 17, 1609, with a president, 4 oidores, and a fiscal. Buenos Aires, created November 2, 1661, with a president, 3 oidores, and a fiscal. Recreated July 2, 1778, when Buenos Aires was made a viceroyalty. Caracas, created June 13, 1786, with a regent, 3 oidores, and a fiscal. Cusco, created February 26, 1787, with a regent, 3 oidores, and a fiscal. Puerto Rico, created June 19, 1831, to consist of a president, regent, 3 oidores, and a fiscal. Havana, created September 26, 1835, reorganized June 16, 1838, to consist of a regent, 4 oidores, and 2 fiscales. 22. Puerto Principe, transferred in 1797 from Santo Domingo, reorganized September 26, 1835, to consist of a regent, 4 oidores, and a fiscal. This audiencia was suppressed and its territory added to that of Havana on October 21, 1853. It was recreated on February 22, 1878, and on May 23, 1879. Santiago de Cuba, created September 26, 1835, to consist of a regent, 4 oidores, and a fiscal. This audiencia was later suppressed, and its territory was added to the audiencia of Havana. It was again reformed and added to Puerto Principe on February 22, 1878. Cebu, Philippines, created February 26, 1886, to consist of a president, 4 magistrates, a fiscal, and an assistant fiscal. Vigan, Philippines, created on May 19, 1893, to consist of 1 Chief Justice, 2 associates, a prosecuting attorney, and an assistant prosecutor. It will be noted that the audiencias of Mexico and Lima contained the greatest number of magistrates. They were divided into 2 salas, a civil and a criminal, with appropriate judges and fiscales for each. 23. The judges of the criminal branch were designated as alcaldes and not as oidores. These audiencias were at first conterminous in territorial jurisdiction with the respective captaincies general of those names, but they enjoyed no greater power or preeminence before the Council of the Indies than the audiencias of the lesser captaincies general. In the words of the Royal Decree of Establishment, there are founded 12 royal audiencias and chancery, in order that our vassals may have persons to rule and govern them in peace and justice, and the districts have been divided into governments, corregimientos and alcaldes mayores who will be provided in accordance with our orders and laws and will be subordinate to our royal audiencias and to our Supreme Council of the Indies. And may no change be made without our express order or that of the Council. 24. Many changes were made in the territorial jurisdiction of the various audiencias. The audiencias of Lima and Mexico, in addition to their jurisdiction over their respective viceroyalties, exercised governmental authority over the adjacent districts when the viceroys were absent. The audiencia of Lima over Charcas, Quito and Tierra Firme, Panama, and that of Mexico over what was later Guadalajara, the Philippines, and Yucatan. All of these, except the latter, came to have audiencias with the usual powers and authority. 25. The first 7 audiencias were founded by Charles V. were created by Philip II. The audiencias of Santiago de Chile and Buenos Aires were established by Philip III and Philip IV, respectively. The greater number of these audiencias was created at the time of the most rapid extension of the tribunals in Spain. Their establishment was part of the same general tendency. They were therefore closely related. When the audiencias of Santo Domingo and Mexico were formed, there had been already in existence in Spain the chanceries of Valladolid and Granada. 13 audiencias were established in Spain after those of Santo Domingo and New Spain were created in the colonies. The 2 Spanish audiencias mentioned above were designated as models for the tribunals of the Indies, and the principle was laid down that if a necessary provision was omitted from the laws of establishment of the colonial audiencias, all the presidents and audiencias of those realms are ordered to preserve the order and practices which are followed in the chanceries of Granada and Valladolid. 26. Territorially, the audiencias of Santo Domingo, Mexico, and Lima were the nuclei from which and around which most of the other audiencias were established. Being the first in their respective sections, they included more territory than they could govern with facility. Thus it later became necessary to divide up their districts. Santo Domingo held sway at first over Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, with authority also over Venezuela and subsequently over Louisiana and Florida. 27. New Granada was conceded an audiencia in 1549, and to this province were added the possessions of Panama when the audiencia of that name was suppressed. The Audiencia of Mexico, created 8 years before New Spain was made a viceroyalty, had territorial jurisdiction at first over a vast empire, which was later divided into smaller governments with audiencias. Its limits, as defined in the Laws of the Indies, extended on both oceans from the Cape of Florida to the Cape of Honduras, and included Yucatan and Tabasco. 28. The audiencias of Guadalajara, Santiago de Guatemala, and Manila all set definite limits to the jurisdiction of the Audiencia of Mexico. The Audiencia of Lima had authority at first over most of Spanish South America, but its scope was in the same manner diminished from time to time by the establishment of the Audiencias of Santa Fe, La Plata, Charcas, Quito, Santiago de Chile, and Buenos Aires. Before the Audiencia of Cusco was instituted in 1787, jurisdiction over that ancient city and district was divided between the Audiencias of Lima and La Plata. Arica, although it belonged to the district of Lima, was not governed under that jurisdiction, but was administered by a corregidor directly responsible to the Audiencia at Charcas. 29. Chile and Panama were subordinate governmentally to the Viceroy of Peru, but the audiencias were independent. 30. Cuba was early divided into two districts under the rule of Captains General, those of Havana and Santiago de Cuba. 31. By Sigilla of February 24, 1784, Havana was made independent of the Audiencia of Santo Domingo in administrative matters. Aside from the one at Puerto Principe, audiencias were not created in Cuba, however, until 1835 and 1838, respectively. Prior to this, Cuba was subject to the Audiencia of Puerto Principe, the successor of Santo Domingo, in judicial matters, as the governments in Cuba were military. However, military cases were carried before the Captains General of Havana and of Santiago de Cuba, respectively. 32. Although all the audiencias had the same rank before the Council of the Indies, both as political and judicial tribunals, those of Lima and Mexico may be said to have been tribunals of the first class, for reasons which we have noted. Indeed, it must be remembered that it was the individual Captain-Chi General that had an audiencia, whether the Captain-Chi General happened to be a viceroyalty or not. Judged by the amount of power they exercised, there were three classes of audiencias, those of the viceroyalties, of the captaincies general, and of the presidencies. On this basis of classification, it may be said that the first mentioned were the superior institutions. In matters of military administration, the captains general had the same power as the viceroys, while the audiencias exercised less intervention in the government than in the presidencies. In the latter, the audiencias and presidents exercised governmental functions as well as judicial, with appeal to the viceroy. Though they had no military power, and their scope was strictly limited in financial affairs, these audiencias actually governed their districts. This the audiencias of the viceroyalties never did, except when they governed ad interim. Before proceeding with a study of the powers and duties of the colonial audiencias, it would be well to compare them, as to extent of jurisdiction and authority, with those which were in operation in Spain. Were they equal? Did the colonial institutions, on account of their isolation, exercise prerogatives which were unknown to the tribunals of the peninsula, or vice versa? These questions were answered by Juan de Solorzano y Pereira, a distinguished Spanish jurist, order of the Audiencia of Lima in 1610, and subsequently, Councillor of the Indies. 33. Solorzano y Pereira illustrates 14 points of difference wherein the audiencias of the colonies exceeded those of the peninsula in power and authority, in these matters exercising jurisdiction equal to the Council of Castile. This, he said, was on account of the great distance intervening between them and the king or his royal council of the Indies, and the dangers which delay may occasion. Therefore, he said, the audiencias had been permitted many privileges and powers denied to the audiencias of Spain. The most important of these powers were, as follows, jurisdiction over residencias of corregidors, the right to send out special investigators, pesquisidores, supervision over inferior judges, seeing that they properly tried cases under their authority, care for the education and good treatment of the Indians in spiritual and temporal matters, and the punishment of officials who were remiss in that particular. The collection of tax, the assumption of the rights and obligations of the royal patronage, as well as jurisdiction over cases affecting the same, the building of churches, the installment of curates and holders of benefices, and the inspection and possible retention of bulls and grapes. The colonial audiencias were instructed to guard their royal prerogative, and were authorized to try all persons accused of usurping the royal jurisdiction. They were to see that officials, lay and ecclesiastical, did not charge excessive fees for their services, limiting especially those exorbitant charges which priests were apt to demand at burials, funerals, marriages and baptisms. The colonial audiencias were given supervision over espolios, 34, collecting, administering and disposing of the properties left by deceased prelates and king, claims of heirs and creditors. Another duty was the restraining of ecclesiastical judges and dignitaries through the recurso de fuerza. 35. This authority had been permitted to the chanceries of Valladolid and Granada only. Although viceroys and governors were granted special jurisdiction over administrative matters, they were authorized to call upon the equitos, 36, of the audiencias for counsel and advice whenever an exceptionally arduous case presented itself. The audiencias were permitted to entertain appeals against the rulings of viceroys and presidents, but these appeals could be carried again to the Council of the Indies. In the same manner that affairs of government belonged to the private jurisdiction of the executive, so did financial matters, according to Solorzano y Pereira. In these, however, the viceroy or governor was assisted in the solution of perplexing problems by the Equito General de Hacienda, a body composed of oidores, oficiales real 37, and contadores. On the death, disability, or absence of the viceroy or governor and captain general, it was ordered that the government should pass under the charge of the entire audiencia. Lastly, Solorzano y Pereira pointed out that while the sole duty of the Spanish oidores was to try cases, the magistrates of the colonial audiencias were called upon for a number of miscellaneous functions, such as those of visitador, or inspector of the provinces, or of other departments of the government, as assessor of the Santa Cruzada, 38, as inspector of ships, as auditor de guerra, as assessor of the governor, and as Jews, the las executorias, under commission of the Council of the Indies, to collect and remit to the government receiver all money derived from fines and penalties imposed by official visitors, visitadores, judges of residencia, etc. 39. With the exception of the entertainment of the recurso de fuerza, none of the above-mentioned functions could be exercised by the audiencias of Spain. Although the colonial audiencias were to a large extent patterned after those of Spain, they had greater power and exercised more extensive functions almost from the beginning. This was chiefly owing to the added responsibilities of government resulting from the isolation of the colonies and their distance from the home government. The audiencias in Spain remained almost purely judicial. There was no need or opportunity for them to encroach upon the executive or to usurp its functions because of the control exercised by its immediate representatives. In the colonies, the audiencias were themselves established as the agents of the royal authority, with the special duty of limiting the abuses of the officials of the crown. In this capacity, aside from their customary duties, the tribunals exercised far-reaching authority of a non-judicial character. It is desirable to point out in this connection that all the colonial audiences utilized the same law in common. Sigilas, edicts, and decrees were issued to them from a common source, to be executed under similar circumstances, or on particular occasions, when local conditions demanded such action. The Great Code of 1680, the Recopilación de las de los Reinos de las Indias, has already been described as containing laws, both general and particular, for the regulation of the colonial audiencias. 40. In the foregoing paragraphs, attention has been directed briefly to the relations of the audiencias and executives with each other, and with the central government. Some notice at least should be given to the means by which the will of the executive and judiciary was enforced and executed upon and in the local units, the provinces and towns. We have already seen that the offices of the corregidores, alcaldes mayores and the alcaldes ordinarios developed in Spain, the first with jurisdiction over the larger districts, the alcaldes mayores over the smaller areas in large towns, and the alcaldes ordinarios in the municipalities. In a general sense, the system was carried into the colonies. The corregidores and alcaldes mayores were in charge of the large provinces and districts. The alcaldes ordinarios were the judges of the Spanish towns. Much the same intercourse and relations existed between these officials in the colonies as had been characteristic of the similar ones of Spain. But there were some differences. While in Spain the alcaldes were in most cases city judges, subject to the corregidores. 41. In the colonies there was little or no difference between alcaldes, mayors and corregidores. They were most frequently appointed by the executive, sometimes independently, sometimes by the assistance and advice of the audiencia, as judges and governors of the provinces, although the laws of the Indies provided for their appointment by the king. The practice developed of designating them locally, and of sending their names to Spain for confirmation. Each alcalde, mayor or corregidor resided at the chief town of his province and combined in himself the functions of judge, inspector of encomiendas, administrator of hacienda and police, collector of tribute, vice-patron, and captain general. 42. He was assisted by officials of a minor category, frequently natives, who exercised jurisdiction over their fellows. The law also provided for a team letrado to assist the alcalde or corregidor. 43. But in the Philippines there was no such official, except at irregular intervals in the visas. These chiefs of provinces were responsible to the audiencias in matters of justice and to the viceroys or captains general in administrative affairs. In Indian relations and in questions involving encomiendas they were subject to the executive, who had jurisdiction in first instance, with appeal to the audiencia. The tribunal could grant encomiendas in default of the regularly appointed executive. In financial matters the corregidores and alcaldes mayores were responsible to the executive, but they acted as the agents of the treasury officials, oficiales real, in the collection of the revenue. In their provinces they supervised the building of ships, the construction of roads and bridges, the repartimientos or polos, 44, of Indians, and the planting of tobacco when the tobacco monopoly existed in the Philippines. In these matters they were responsible to the governor, viceroy, or superintendent, and to the various juntas, reals and committees, of which at least one order was always a member. Tributes from the Indians, tithes from the encomenderos and other kinds of local taxes were collected by the alcaldes mayores and corregidores. Acting for the vice-patron, these officials represented the subdelegated authority of the king over the monasteries and churches of their provinces. They officiated at the formal bestowal of benefices. They were expected to maintain harmonious relations with the priests and friars in their provinces, and to check, by their personal presence and intervention, if necessary, any tendency on the part of the churchmen to abuse the Indians or to impose upon them. In like manner they were supposed to prevent the ecclesiastical judges from exceeding their power, and particularly from transgressing the royal jurisdiction, which frequently occurred in the earlier years when that authority had not become clearly defined or firmly established. as the churchmen with whom these officials had to deal derived their authority from the higher prelates and the provincials of the orders and often acted by the direction. Their opposition to the local officials of the civil government was frequently so effective that the latter were obliged to appeal to the Audiencia. The latter tribunal had the power necessary to deal with these cases and to restrain the offending churchmen by bringing pressure to bear upon their prelates and superiors. The provincial governors also had certain military duties. In the northern provinces of New Spain they had charge of defense, with responsibility to the viceroy. 45. In the Philippines, however, and in certain parts of New Spain, where the Captain General took the place of the viceroy, alcaldes mayores and corregidores acted as lieutenants of the Captains General, exercising authority of a military character. 46. They were required to defend their provinces and districts against invasions, insurrections, Indian outbreaks, and disturbances. They were authorized to impress men for military service. Local conditions in Mexico, Peru, Central America, and the Philippines caused some differentiation in these matters. This description will serve to convey an impression of the nature of the duties of these officials and the way in which they acted as agents of the Captain General, Viceroy, and Audiencia. 47. It has been already pointed out that the alcaldes mayores and corregidores had extensive judicial duties. A mere restatement of that important fact will suffice at this time. In subsequent chapters, we shall study in detail numerous illustrations and instances of the judicial functions of the provincial judges. It has been noted also that the alcaldes ordinarios were the judges of the Spanish towns. So, they were in the Philippines, but as there were only 4 or 5 Spanish towns in the archipelago, the alcaldes ordinarios do not assume great prominence in this study. These alcaldes were usually chosen by the ayuntamientos, municipal councils, though they were appointed on some occasions by the governors. As the Spanish towns enjoyed special privileges conferred by the king, their judges were not a part of the regular judicial hierarchy, but were dependent on their ayuntamientos or the governor. However, an order was usually delegated to inspect the work of the alcalde ordinario. With this introductory view of the general field of Spanish colonial administration, and this presentation of the characters and elements, which are to assume important roles in this discussion because of their frequent relations with the Audiencia, we may enter upon a more detailed study of a single institution. It has been emphasized, especially that the Audiencia in the Philippines was only an integral part of the governmental machinery used in the colonial empire of Spain. It is clear, therefore, that we are not studying an isolated tribunal. For every royal sagema promulgated to the Philippine Audiencia was in some way related to those issued to 10 or 11 other audiencias of equal status or similar character. Although the Philippines were apart physically, this institution, with its relation to the provincial and colonial governments on one hand, and the home government on the other, brought the colony as close as possible to Spain and to the other colonies. It is certain that the growth of audiencias was a part, not only of colonial, but of Spanish historical and institutional development. These institutions served the same purpose in the colonies that they accomplished in Spain. They were utilized for the administration of justice, and to check the excesses and abuses of officials. They were important because they facilitated a greater degree of centralization. They converged the provincial, colonial, intercolonial and home governments in the same manner as the audiencias in Spain brought about unity in provincial and national judicial administration. Chapter 2. The establishment of the Audiencia of Manila, 1583 to 1598. The conditions which determined the establishment of an audiencia in the Philippines differed little, if at all, from those in Spain's other colonies. All of Spain's dependencies were situated at great distances from the mother country. The Philippines were farther away than any. Furthermore, the Philippines were isolated and could not be successfully maintained if dependent on or identified with any other colony. distance and other factors which we shall note made undesirable and impracticable a continuance of established relations with New Spain. If, however, the governor of the Philippines came to be almost absolute in his authority, his absolutism differed in degree rather than in kind from that of the governors and viceroys of other colonies. The contiguity of China and Japan, the constant danger of military invasion and naval attack by outside enemies, and the dependence of the colony on the commerce of China also made the case of the Philippines somewhat different from that of the colonies in America. In general, the situation in the Philippines called for a distinct audiencia with the same powers and functions as were exercised by the audiencias of the other colonies. A system for the administration of justice in the Philippines had been definitely established and organized before the audiencia was inaugurated in 1584. Many prominent features of the judicial and administrative systems of Spain and America had been already introduced into the islands. At the head of both judicial and administrative affairs was the Governor-in-Captain General, who was practically absolute, and whose authority was final except in certain matters of litigation which could be appealed to the Audiencia of Mexico. Subordinate to him were the alcaldes mayores and corregidores, whose functions have been already noted. In the Philippines, as elsewhere, the latter officials acted as magistrates and governors of provinces, combining judicial and administrative attributes. Directly subordinate to them were the encomenderos, whose holdings, including lands and Indians, may be said to have constituted the unit of the Spanish colonial land system until the close of the 18th century. 48. As in Spain, so in the Spanish towns of the Philippines, there were alcaldes ordinarios, or municipal judges, elected by the citizens in some cases, or appointed by the governor in others. 49. But the system as established was defective in many respects. The Governor-in-Captain General was Chief Judge, Executive, and Commander of the military forces. In him were centralized all the functions of justice and government exercised in the provinces through the alcaldes mayores and corregidors. The latter officials he appointed ad interim, supervised their administrative duties, and heard judicial cases appealed from them. He likewise exercised supervision over the oficiales real, who were entrusted with the collection, care and expenditure of the funds of the colony. 50. During the period before the establishment of the audiencia, the governor exercised complete control over all branches and departments of the government, provincial, municipal, and insular, in matters of justice, administration, and finance. The centralization of all this authority in the person of one official made his position responsible and powerful, but capable of much abuse. And it was the abuses incidental to the exercise of absolute power by the governor that led to the establishment of the Audiencia of Manila. Probably the most important indirect reason for the establishment of an audiencia in the Philippines may be noted in the abuses connected with the administration of the encomiendas. These may be attributed both to the powerlessness and inefficiency of the governors and to their cupidity and deliberate favoritism to the encomenderos. As a result of the rapid spread of these encomiendas, 51 settlements, or agricultural estates, for such they were, and their location in distant and widely separated parts of the archipelago, the encomenderos came to have increased responsibilities and powers. They were far removed from the central authority at Manila. They were infrequently inspected by the alcaldes mayores and corregidors in whose districts they were situated. Indeed, the encomiendas had spread so rapidly in the Philippines that the governmental machinery provided by Spain was unable to provide for them. In 1591, for example, there were 267 encomiendas containing 667,612 souls. These were supervised by 12 alcaldes mayores. 52, 140 priests were provided to minister to this large congregation of natives. The Philippine government, with an autocratic military governor at its head, had been originally designed for one settlement or province, and not for an extensive military possession, distributed over a widely separated area, with insufficient means of communication and transportation. Under the conditions outlined above, the encomenderos were permitted to forget the benign purposes for which they had been originally entrusted with the care and protection of the natives. The Indians on the encomiendas were reduced to the condition of slaves. They were mistreated, overtaxed, overworked, cheated, neglected, flogged, and abused. 53. Their protectors had become their exploiters. The churchmen who were supposed to act as their guardians and spiritual aides were insufficient in number to render effective service. Many of the latter served the interests of the encomenderos, and the latter were decidedly unfavorable to the introduction of more priests. The local officials of government and justice were in most cases too far away to care for and protect the natives, or even to visit the more remote encomiendas in their districts. Moreover, many of them were themselves encomenderos, perpetrating abuses on their own tenants, and accordingly little inclined to sacrifice their own interests for the protection of the natives on other encomiendas. Finally, the governor, located at the distant capital, was possibly ignorant of the real state of affairs. At any rate, he failed to enforce the laws which commanded humane treatment of the natives, leaving to the encomenderos, the alcaldes, mayors, and corregidors the administration of the provinces and the supervision of the encomiendas. 54. Efforts have been made for the correction of these abuses and to bring about a more effective control of the encomiendas by the governor. Early in the history of the islands, the king had empowered governors and viceroys to grant encomiendas for life, with 30 years remission of tribute to those who had participated in the conquest. Legazpi and Mavizers, the first two governors of the Philippines, had given encomiendas without limit to favorites, relatives, and friends. Consequently, when Sen became governor, he was obliged to direct much of his attention to the eradication of the resultant evils, and he attempted to establish the encomiendas on a profitable and honest basis. He dispossessed many of the holders of these large tracts and reserved them for the crown as royal encomiendas, thus creating a revenue for the newly established and financially embarrassed government. 55. Sen made royal many of the hitherto unprofitable encomiendas which had been in private hands. 56. On account of these acts, Sen became very unpopular in Manila, and so unpleasant were his relations with the residents that, having no protection or recourse, he was obliged to give up his command, practically driven from the island by his enemies. The only person in the Philippines who exercised any sort of check on the governor was the bishop, with whom he was ordered to consult frequently. These consultations were often productive of bitter quarrels. The first prelate of the Philippines, Bishop Salazar, arrived in 1581, and throughout his ecclesiastical administration, exercised influence of a far-reaching character. It was he who first showed the need of a royal audiencia to check the encroachments of the governor on the prerogatives of the church, for the protection of the natives, and for the safeguarding of the royal interests. Bishop Salazar was a determined opponent of Governor Sen, whom he accused of excessive indulgence in trade and the extortion of large sums from the encomenderos. On June 20, 1582, he wrote to the council, "If I were as rich as Governor Sen, I would engage to pay any sum of money." He also testified that the government here is a place for the enrichment of governors. They carry away as much as 400,000 ducats, knowing that they will have to pay a share of it at the residencia, but they steal enough to do that also. 57. The government of the Philippines, prior to the establishment of the Audiencia of Manila, during the period 1565 to 1584, was subordinate to the Viceroy and to the Audiencia in Mexico. The time required for the transmission of documents and correspondence, the fewness of ships available for the voyage between the Philippines and New Spain, and the unsatisfactory means of communication resulting therefrom, seriously inconvenienced the residents of the colony. In matters of government injustice, appeals had to be taken to Mexico. This proceeding involved great loss of time and expense, and was especially inimical to the administration of justice. The assignment and regulation of encomiendas, the supervision of financial affairs, the control of the Chinese trade, the dispatch of the galleons to New Spain, and the assignment of cargo space on these ships, were all matters which, at that great distance, and at that time, called for divided control. The execution of all these duties was too great a charge for the human frailties of one man. The governor could do it neither honestly nor well. The necessity was apparent of having a central government in Manila which would be self-sufficient in itself. That is, independent of New Spain, and at the same time capable of repairing its own defects. The relations which existed between the Manila government and the authorities of New Spain are illustrated by a letter which Governor Gonzalo Ronquillo de Penalosa wrote a month later than the correspondence above alluded to. In this letter he announced the arrival of a ship from Mexico, which, he said, bore nothing but charges against him. These complaints, he alleged, had been formulated by agents of Dr. Francisco Dasan, his predecessor, whose residencia he had conducted and whom he had deprived of his office as governor. Ronquillo wrote that, nevertheless, sand has been received in that royal audiencia of Mexico as order, as a result of which all those who love justice may well despair. They meddle with my government from Mexico, giving orders to my corregidors without consulting me, and addressing private individuals in regard to the supplies, directing them to keep watch over this or that matter. They impose grave penalties upon me, and no matter how small the affair may be, they refuse to listen to me or to hear my side of the question. 58. He concluded by pointing out the inconsistency of his position, subject as he was to send the man whom he had displaced because of the former's unfitness to occupy the post of governor. Although Governor Ronquillo de Penalosa did not ask for an audiencia on this occasion, he did petition for an educated assistant to aid him in the administration of justice. The trouble here, he wrote to the king, in the letter above quoted, is that the people are of such a nature that, at the same time when justice is done to one, an enemy is made of another person. The rule of Ronquillo de Penalosa as governor was distinctly typical of the possibilities of an absolute executive, far removed from the restraining influence of the courts, with scarcely any limitation upon his operations. Appointed as he had been for life, with proprietary attributes, and with the power of naming his successor, Ronquillo de Penalosa was the first governor sent out from Spain in pursuance of the policy of entrusting frontier commands to military men who were fitted by profession and experience to deal with situations which demanded the qualities of the soldier, rather than those of the administrator and politician. An attempt thus seems to have been made to remedy the ills which had been characteristic of the administration of levisers and sand by entrusting the governor with more centralized power, an attempt to correct the evils of absolutism with the mailed fist and more absolutism, backed by military power. The bishop, who at this time kept the court well informed of the weaknesses of the government, as they appeared to him, sent many complaints against Ronquillo de Penalosa, as other churchmen had done against former governors. Not only did the bishop himself write repeatedly, but he influenced the municipal and ecclesiastical chapters of Manila to send protests against the governor's misrule. It was largely owing to Salazar's influence that Captain Gabriel de Rivera was sent to Spain with a petition signed by most of the influential men of the colony, asking for various reforms. Among these, the establishment of a royal audiencia was especially requested. 59. On the occasion of Ronquillo's death in 1583, the bishop called attention to the straits into which the colony had fallen as a result of the tyrannical methods of the deceased governor. 60. He described Ronquillo's efforts to prevent residents from appealing to the audiencia and viceroy of New Spain. He stated that the Indians had been unjustly treated by the encomenderos and alcaldes mayores, for when appeals had been made to the governor, the latter, on a plea of being too busy to occupy himself with such minute details, had ordered the alcaldes mayores to settle the questions at issue without disturbing him. Ronquillo was said to have engaged extensively in commerce, monopolizing the ships to the exclusion of the merchants, and forcing large loans from the officials and residents, who did not dare to refuse him, lest all their privileges be taken from them. He had established private encomiendas in nearly every town in Luzon, appropriating the income therefrom, instead of turning the proceeds into the royal treasury. 61. This the prelate conceded to be in accordance with the conditions of the governor's appointment, but it was nevertheless unjust, as the privilege of holding encomiendas was denied to other officials, and the treasury of the colony was in need of the revenue which had been daily enriching the governor. The bishop accused the governor of seizing Indians, placing them in encomienda wherever and whenever he found them, irrespective of whether they were already free or whether they belonged on other encomiendas. These acts, he said, had caused the Indians to be dissatisfied and rebellious, and he evidently was of the opinion that a revolt was impending when he penned this memorial. Many times I have prayed, he wrote, that God should close the natives' eyes, in order that they may not see the weakness and the little power with which we might resist them in case they should arise to put down these evils. The bishop closed this memorial with a vigorous protest against the continuance of the hereditary principle in the succession of governors in the Philippines. He made the general recommendation that in the future governors should be appointed by the king, with a view to securing men of administrative and executive ability. He brought forth strenuous objections to the accession of the ex-governor's nephew, Diego Ronquillo de Penalosa, who was not fitted to occupy the post of governor. If the latter assumed the government, the bishop could see nothing in store for the colony but a continuation of the evil days which had been extant throughout the administration of the elder Ronquillo, who had spent all his time in gathering wealth for himself by means of trade, shutting his eyes and ears to those who asked justice of him. Salazar expressed the opinion that had Gonzalo Ronquillo de Penalosa spent as much of his time in making conquests and discoveries as he had in making packages of merchandise, the prosperity of the islands and the general welfare would have been his chief aim. 62. Although the decree establishing an audiencia in the Philippines was promulgated before the above memorial reached court, there is no question but that the influence of Bishop Salazar did much towards bringing about the creation of a tribunal in the islands. Indeed, Salazar has been given all the credit for this by more than one authority. 63. While the bishop did exert an important influence in bringing about this change, the support which he received from residents of the colony was also of immense advantage. Many individuals, aggrieved by the abuses of the executive, wrote vigorous complaints against the tyranny of an absolute governor, who alone and unchecked reserves to himself excessive power. Their letters emphasized the injustice of having appears carried to Mexico, where the people of Manila never get their deserts, and where they suffer on account of the distance. Various encomenderos had been wronged by the acts of the governor in dividing their encomiendas and reducing the number of Indians thereon. They had appealed to Mexico, and after waiting over 2 years, had despaired of ever getting any return for the money and the time which they had spent in litigation at the distant capital. As a possible means of relief, they requested the establishment of a royal audiencia at Manila. 64. Another person who exerted considerable influence toward the establishment of an audiencia in the Philippines was Captain Gabriel de Rivera, who went to Madrid for that purpose. He was the first Procurador General de los Islas del Poniente, and it was his duty to represent at court the needs of the colony and of its inhabitants. 65. Rivera acted as the personal agent of Salazar in his advocacy of the establishment of an audiencia, and it was largely due to his efforts that the institution was established when it was. In his memorial of February 16, 1582, Rivera criticized the existing administration in the Philippines, the proprietary governorship, and the control over commerce which the governor had exercised. The latter had levied the almajarifazgo and other customs duties in defiance of the royal sigillus forbidding them, and without consulting the wishes of the merchants or officials. Rivera alleged that the Almaguer and the Alcapala were ruining the commerce of the islands. 66. His memorial treated extensively of the abuses which had occurred in the administration of the encomiendas, and he pointed out numerous defects in the judicial system of the colonies. He suggested the establishment of a royal audiencia to consist of 3 judges, having criminal and civil jurisdiction, without appeal to any other tribunal than the Council of the Indies. The audiencia as outlined by him was to have administrative powers as well as judicial. It was to govern as a commission, with a governor at its head, chosen for a term of 6 years. 67. This scheme, he said, if put into operation, would result in no increased expense to the crown or colony. He proposed the abolition of the 3 oficiales real, suggesting the substitution of 3 oidores in their places, thus extending the jurisdiction of the audiencia to matters of finance. The new tribunal should likewise take cognizance of the assignment of encomiendas and see that in all cases the royal will was obeyed. The audiencia should exercise supervision over the alcaldes mayores in their relation to the encomiendas, with a view to remedying the existing abuses and seeing that justice was done to the Indians. The audiencia should hear cases appealed from the alcaldes, mayors and corregidors instead of allowing these suits to be heard by the governor or sent to Mexico. Rivera also urged that there should be a special defender of the Indians as a part of the audiencia. 68. Enough has been noted of the evils of the government as it existed before the establishment of the audiencia to understand the reasons for the creation of the tribunal. The whole matter summarizes itself in the excesses of the governor and the necessity of protecting all classes of society from his absolutism. These abuses called for the establishment of a tribunal near the New Spain, which would, in a safe and expeditious manner, impose the necessary limitations upon the governor, ensure an equitable collection and an economical expenditure of the public revenue, and bring about particularly the elimination of official corruption. It was desirable to protect the merchant and his legitimate business, to ensure stability in the relations of church and state, and to obviate the existing evils in the administration of the provincial governments. The latter meant the assignment of encomiendas in accordance with the law to deserving individuals instead of to friends and relatives of the governors, or to other prominent officials of the colony. It also meant that the natives on these encomiendas should be protected from the rapacity of the encomenders. It was realized that an effort should be made to ensure the imparting of religious instruction to the natives, in partial return for tribute paid by them. Finally, it meant the establishment of a tribunal which would have power to enforce the law prescribing that the alcaldes mayores and corregidors should exercise faithful supervision over these matters which were within their jurisdiction. A tribunal was needed, not merely to hear such appeals as might come to it by process of law, but with authority to intervene actively in affairs of government, checking the abuses of the governor and protecting the community from his absolutism. The proposition to establish an independent audiencia in Manila was opposed by the Viceroy and Audiencia of New Spain. The latter tribunal wrote a letter of protest to the Council of the Indies, demanding that in matters of government and justice the colony of the Philippines should continue to bear the same relations to the Viceroyalty of New Spain as did Guadalajara. 69. Rivera answered these objections in a special memorial, stating that the isolation of the Philippines alone justified the establishment of an audiencia and an independent government. He also pointed out that the nearness of Japan and China and the necessity of dealing with them required the presence of a sovereign tribunal in Manila. He asserted that the colony could deal directly with the Council of the Indies more profitably than through the Audiencia of Mexico. The latter mode of procedure was indirect and cumbersome, and it exposed litigants to the meddling of the oidores of Mexico in matters which they did not understand. 70. Finally, the Audiencia of Manila was established by decree of Philip II on May 5, 1583, in the following terms. Whereas in the interests of good government and the administration of our justice, we have accorded the establishment in the city of Manila in the island of Luzon of one of our royal audiencias and chanceries, in which there shall be a president, 3 orators, a fiscal, and the necessary officials. And whereas we have granted that this audientia should have the same authority and preeminence as each one of our royal audientias which sit in the town of Valladolid and the city of Granada, of these our realms, and the other audientias of our Indies, now therefore we order to be made and sent to the said island a royal seal, with which are to be stamped our decisions which are made and issued by the said president and orators in the said audientia. 71. The jurisdiction of the tribunal, it is to be noted, extended throughout the island of Luzon and the rest of the islands of the archipelago, as well as over the mainland of China, whether discovered or yet to be discovered. The decree which provided for the foundation of the Audiencia of Manila consisted of 313 sections. Although the Audiencia was subsequently abolished for a few years, it was re-established in 1598 and these articles were again utilized. It is therefore worthwhile to notice the most important provisions of the law of establishment, which was to serve as a foundation for the Audiencia during a period of approximately 300 years. The first 38 sections were devoted to the creation of the tribunal, to a definition of its jurisdiction over civil and criminal cases, and to a determination of the proper method of procedure in them. The Audiencia was to have authority to try cases of appeal from gobernadores, alcaldes mayores, and other magistrates of the provinces. It also had jurisdiction over civil cases appealed from the alcaldes ordinarios of the city and original jurisdiction over all criminal cases arising within 5 links of the city of Manila. Appeals were to appeals were to be tried by revista, review, before the tribunal. Cases of first instance, vista, were not to be tried in the tribunal, excepting those to which the government was a party, or the above-mentioned criminal cases. The judgment of the audiencia was usually to be final in ordinary suits, and always in criminal cases. Those involving the government, and civil suits exceeding a certain value were appealable to the Council of the Indies. Notice of appeal to the latter tribunal had to be served within 1 year after the objectionable decision was rendered, and the party appealing the case was obliged to post financial bonds covering the expenses of suit in case the final judgment were not favorable to him. The decision of the audiencia was to be executed in all cases, even though an appeal to the Council of the Indies had been made. The procedure followed in the chanceries of Valladolid and Granada was to be enforced in the audiencia of Manila except when the contrary was especially ordered. Investigations might be made by one judge, but the concurrence of two was necessary for all decisions involving the reversal of a former judgment, or in cases wherein a certain amount was at stake. In the latter case, an assistant judge might be chosen from outside the audiencia to assist the regular magistrate. The audiencia was forbidden to act alone in the selection of judges, of residencias or pesquisidores. It was commanded not to interfere with governors of provinces, but it had the right, when charges had been made by private individuals, to conduct investigations of governors' official conduct. The audiencia was empowered to investigate the judges of provinces. Magistrates were forbidden to hear cases affecting themselves or their relatives, and when a case involving more than 1,000 pesos was before the tribunal, and no order was eligible to try it, an alcalde ordinario might serve in the place of a regular magistrate, with appeal to the Council of the Indies. Criminal charges against the oidores were to be tried by the president, with the assistance, if need be, of such alcaldes ordinarios as the latter might select. No relative of the president or of an order could be appointed legally to a corregidorship or to an encomienda. Oidores were eligible for appointment by the president from time to inspect the administration of justice and government in the provinces. Oidores were forbidden to receive fees from or to act as advocates for any private person, and they could not hold income yielding estates in arable land or cattle. Oidores were forbidden to engage in business, either singly or in partnership, nor could they avail themselves of the compulsory services of Indians under pain of deprivation of office. Any person could bring suit against an order. As noted above, such cases would either be tried by the president or by an alcalde ordinario on the president's designation. Such cases might be appealed to the Council of the Indies. The audiencia, according to the terms of its establishment, had extensive authority over matters of government. In case of the death or incapacity of the president, the audiencia was to assume control of affairs, the senior order filling the post of president and captain general, with special charge over military matters. Under such circumstances, the administrative and executive functions were to be administered by the audiencia as a body. The governor, who was also president of the audiencia, was ordered to make a complete report annually to the Council of the Indies on the state of the government and the finances of the colony, including an account of the gross income and expenditures, a survey of conditions of the encomiendas and corregimientos, as well as a report on the conduct of officials, including oidores. In fact, all matters that came regularly under the care of the executive were to be covered in the annual report of the governor and captain general of the islands. The president was empowered to delegate the oidores, in turn, to make tours of inspection in the provinces. The magistrates, as visitors, were to inquire into the character of service rendered by the alcaldes, mayors in the administration of government and justice. They were to note the state of the towns and their needs, the means taken for the construction and preservation of public buildings, and the condition of the Indians on the encomiendas. They were to see whether they were faithfully and efficiently instructed in religion, or whether they were permitted to live in ignorance and idolatry. Reports were to be made by the visitors on the state of the soil, the condition of the crops and harvests, extent of mineral wealth and timber in the provinces under investigation, weights and measures, and in fact, everything that had to do with the general welfare. On these trips, the oidores were authorized to take such action as they felt to be necessary. Two oidores were also required to make weekly inspections of the prisons of the colony. The decree of establishment also directed that certain phases of ecclesiastical affairs should claim the attention of the audiencia. The chief duty of the tribunal in that regard was to keep the ecclesiastical judges from exceeding their authority, and the practices of the audiencias of Spain were especially prescribed as a precedent for the local tribunal. The audiencia was charged with supervision over the assignment of benefices, and especially with the settlement of the property and estates of bishops and archbishops who died in the islands. The audiencia was ordered to permit nothing to be done which would be in prejudice of the rights and prerogatives of the Church. The tribunal was instructed to assist the prelates on all occasions when they petitioned for royal aid. It was also to see that properly accredited bulls were read and applied in the Spanish towns, but not in the native villages. As noted above, suits involving the royal treasury and the collection of money for the government were to be reviewed and decided before any other that might come up in the royal audiencia. It was the duty of the fiscal to prosecute these cases in the interest of the government. At the beginning of each year, the president and two magistrates were to audit the reports of the oficials real, and if these reports were not duly and properly rendered, the salaries of these officials were to be withheld. After auditing the accounts, the committee was to count the money in the royal treasury. The oidores who did this extra work were to receive an allowance of 25,000 maravedis, about 56 pesos, in addition to their regular salary. The authorization of the audiencia was necessary for the payment of extraordinary expenses not appearing in the regular budget, and these disbursements were made subject to the later approval of the Council of the Indies. The audiencia was held responsible in these matters by the Council. Full reports of expenditures made on the responsibility of the audiencia were to be made to the Council, and the oidores were held accountable in their residencias for their votes cast in the junta or acuerdo de hacienda, as the committee was called. The audiencia was given supervision over the administration of the estates of deceased persons. It was to examine the accounts of executors and see that the wills of the deceased were faithfully executed and that all was done in accordance with the law. For this purpose, an order was delegated each year with authority to dispose of these cases in the name of the audiencia. In a subsequent chapter, the duties and activities of this administrator or justabins de defuntos will be enlarged upon. Considerable space in this decree was devoted to prescribing the rules for the trial of cases involving Indians, with a view to securing justice both in their administration by the encomenderos, and in the supervision which the alcaldes mayores exercised over the encomenderos. The provision was made that our said president and oidores shall always take great care to be informed of the crimes and abuses which are committed against the Indians under our royal crown, or against those granted in encomiendas to other persons by the governors. The audiencia was directed to exercise care that the said Indians shall be better treated and instructed in our holy Catholic faith, as our free vassals. The audiencia was required to exercise care that suits involving Indians were neither lengthy nor involved, that decisions were reached promptly and without unnecessary litigation, and that the rights, customs, and practices to which the Indians had always been accustomed should be continued in so far as was practicable. The audiencia and the bishop were to see that there was a person appointed in each village to give instruction in religion. Alcaldes mayores were ordered not to dispossess native chiefs of their rule or authority. They were, on the contrary, to appeal cases involving them without delay to the audiencia or to the visiting order. The audiencia was to devote 2 days a week to hearing suits to which Indians were parties. Encomenderos were to be protected by the audiencia in the possession of their encomiendas. A proportionate amount of attention in the sigilla is devoted to outlining the duties of the fiscal, who, from many points of view, was the most important official directly connected with the tribunal. It was his function to appear as prosecutor for the government in all cases tried before the Audiencia, and he was forbidden to serve as an advocate of any private person during his term of office. He should devote his attention especially to matters involving the exchequer. He was to prosecute all cases of appeal from the alcaldes, mayors, and corregidors on behalf of the government, and he was to take care to assist and favor poor Indians in the suits that they have, and to see that they are not oppressed, maltreated, or wronged. The fiscal, ordinarily, was not to prosecute unless it were on the complaint of some person, but in cases of notorious injustice, or when judicial inquiry was being made, he could take the initiative on his own account. It was his duty to perform any and all legal acts which were consistent with his position, and which were designed to bring about justice or to secure the royal interests. The remaining sections of this decree, and, in fact, the greater part of it, are devoted to establishing the duties of the fiscal and the minor officials of the Audiencia, to fixing a tariff of fees to be charged for notarial and other legal work, and to the determination of other matters which are of no great consequence to the purposes of this chapter. Among the minor officials attached to the Audiencia were the alguacil, mayor, and his 2 deputies. These were to act as the executive officers of the court and were empowered to make arrests, serve papers, and execute similar functions. Their duties, as a whole, were much like those of the English or American constable or sheriff. They might arrest, on their own initiative, persons whom they caught in crime, as, for example, those playing forbidden games of chance, or indulging in immoral practices, typical particularly of the Chinese. The alguacil was responsible for the maintenance of the prison of the Audiencia. For this purpose he could appoint a certain number of jail wardens. There were also clerks of court and notaries, chosen by royal appointment. Their duties were those customarily required of such officials, not differing from those of today. The Audiencia likewise had official reporters, similar to the court reporters of the present day. Advocates and attorneys practicing before the Audiencia had to fulfill certain prescribed requirements in regard to learning, training, and general ability. Receivers, bailiffs, jail wardens, and interpreters each received their due amount of space and attention in this citula. The interpreters were to assist the Indians who were defending themselves in a Spanish-speaking court. Among their duties was the translation of the testimony of witnesses, of the questions of attorneys, and the rulings of the courts into the native dialects, or into the Spanish language, as the circumstances might require. These interpreters were also required to assist the natives in the formulation of legal documents. All these minor officials were to be regulated in the collection of fees by a legal tariff. Finally, the Audiencia was provided with an archive within which were to be deposited and kept the Great Seal of the government, and all official papers, including records of cases and official acts. The new Audiencia having been provided for, Santiago de Vera, the recently appointed governor and captain general of the island and president of the new tribunal, arrived at Manila on May 28, 1584. In accordance with the new law, it was his duty to govern the Philippines in the capacity of executive and military commander, and at the same time preside over the Audiencia in its respective judicial, advisory, and administrative capacities. The first session of the Audiencia was held on June 15, 1584. 72. The new tribunal was officially brought into being with much pomp and ceremony, including a procession of the president and magistrates in their robes of office, and the celebration of divine service in the cathedral by the bishop. The president and each of the oradors subsequently made lengthy reports to the Council of the Indies on the inauguration of the tribunal. The most direct and striking consequence of the establishment of the Audiencia in Manila was the discord which it engendered between the various officials and functionaries of the government. Whereas, before the inauguration of the tribunal, the chief aim of the colony had been the unrivaled absolutism and the high-handed proceedings of the governor, now, with the division of power newly effected, the creation of new departments, and the checking of one official against another, strife and contention took the place of despotism. there were but few misunderstandings between the Ordores over their judicial duties. The functions of the Audiencia, as a court, were clearly defined and distinctly understood. Although appeals were made from the Audiencia to the Council of the Indies, as appeals are always made from a minor court to a superior tribunal, there was little dissatisfaction with the body in the exercise of its purely legal functions. Its value in protecting the natives on the Encomiendas from the tyranny of their masters, the facility rendered to the administration of justice by making appeal to New Spain unnecessary, and the advantage of having immediately at hand a tribunal with plenary powers were readily recognized. The chief objection to the tribunal developed as a result of the Audiencia's interference in matters of government and administration. Disputes arose between the governor and the Ordores, and among the Ordores themselves. The lack of experience in the local field of the president and magistrates may have been one of the causes of the unsatisfactory conditions immediately following the establishment of the Audiencia. Another and possibly a more important reason lay in the nature and wording of the Articles of Establishment. A certain amount of confusion existed in the minds of all as to the extent of power which the Audiencia should have in governmental and ecclesiastical affairs. No definite distinction had been drawn between the powers of the president and those of the Ordores in matters of government, and the former at once accused the latter of infringing upon the jurisdiction of the executive. The Ordores, on the other hand, claimed that their advice should be taken in all matters of appointment, defense, patronage, both ecclesiastical and secular, finance, commerce and interior administration. They began to intervene actively in those matters, to the displeasure of the governor and treasury officials. All the Ordores, as well as the fiscal, wrote lengthy memorials and reports to the king, offering advice on this affair or that, and criticizing the governor, the bishop, and the officials reals for acts done within their own spheres of authority. In sending these reports and in making these suggestions, the magistrates did not question their own authority, and they resented exceedingly the objections and charges of interference by those concerned. An illustration may be noted in the letter written on July 3, 1584, by Order Melchior Davalos to the king. After several clear intimations that he would like to be governor in case a vacancy should arise, and after modestly setting forth his own qualifications and virtues, Davalos wrote a faithful and vivid account of the expeditions which had been made recently against the Mohammedan Sulis. He petitioned for a suspension of the law forbidding slavery in order that Spaniards might avail themselves of captive Moros as slaves. 73. He made several recommendations in regard to the Chinese, stating particularly that he was devoting himself to a study of the kind of government best fitted for the Chinese in Manila. He complained that the Chinese merchants were draining the islands of silver, bringing as many as 34 shiploads of Chinese cargo a year. Since nothing of commercial value was produced in the Philippines, they could take away nothing else than silver. This incessant drain on the coin imported from Acapulco was resulting in the impoverishment of the colony and constituted a source of danger to New Spain as well. The exploitation of money was contrary to royal orders and distinctly prejudicial to the economic interests of the realm. Davalos recommended immediate action in the matter. He then discussed military affairs, alleging that the pay of the soldiers was insufficient, and their condition miserable. The first and third of the matters touched upon by the order in his memorial, namely, the war in Mindanao and the condition of the soldiers, belonged to the private jurisdiction of the governor and captain general. 74. The control of the Chinese coming later under the jurisdiction of the governor, as captain general, with special inhibition of the interference of the Audiencia. 75. This letter furnishes a good illustration of the interference of an order in matters of government. The desire to interfere does not seem to have been confined to one individual, but was apparently characteristic of all the magistrates of the Audiencia. 76. The extensive field over which the Ordores claimed cognizance is shown by a series of memorials which were sent by the Audiencia as a body to the court under the date of June 26, 1586. 77, they are noted here because they illustrate the diversity of the interests of voidores, and because their devotion to these various matters was characterized as unjustified meddling by the governor and the other opponents of the audiencia. The concern which the voidores manifested in the miscellaneous affairs of government constituted, no doubt, an indirect reason for the temporary removal of the tribunal in 1589. These memorials suggested reform in many departments of government. The inadequate state of defense and the demoralized condition into which the garrison had fallen was the subject of one letter. Attention was called to the necessity of obtaining more funds for the fortifications of the islands. Reference was made to the continual danger of Japanese invasion. Another letter dealt with financial affairs. The public exchequer was reported to be in bad condition, as there was not enough money in the treasury to pay the expenses of government. The voidores recommended that their own salaries should be paid out of the Treasury of Mexico. They suggested an increase of tribute as a means of securing more money. This, they alleged, could be done in justice, since the amount of tribute paid by the natives of the Philippines did not equal that levied upon the Indians of New Spain. 78. The voidores reported an increase of 5,000 pesos in the revenues of the colony as profits from the sale of certain offices which had formerly been bestowed gratis by the governor upon his friends, the righting of this wrong being effected through the influence of the fiscal and voidores who officiated as members of the Junta de Hacienda, while ostensibly seeking means for the enlargement of the income of the islands. As noted, the voidores protested against the recent royal order which had required that the proceeds returned from vacant encomiendas should be placed in the public treasury. They objected that this would take away all hope of reward from soldiers and subjects who have served Your Majesty, reducing them to poverty with no means of support after a long career of service. 79. In other words, the audiencia is here seen registering its objections to the conversion of private into rural encomiendas, notwithstanding the fact that this would mean greater revenue for the government. The inconsistency of this attitude was pointed out by Magistrate Davalos in his letter of June 20, 1585. 80. Another petition which may reflect some discredit upon the audiencia was one which asked for the abolition of the 1 1/2% tax on imported money and for the elimination of the 3% almajarifazgo. Both of these taxes bore heavily on the Chinese and on the Spanish merchants of Manila. These two taxes, wrote the voidores, are drawing the lifeblood from the Chinese, who would otherwise bring products of great value to our shores. The voidores had commenced this memorial by showing the financial needs of the colony. They had requested assistance from the Treasury of Mexico, yet, in the same communication, they proposed to abolish 3 of the most profitable sources of colonial revenue that existed. These recommendations not only illustrate the wide sphere of influence of the magistrates, but they also seem to confirm the allegations which were often brought against them, charges, indeed, which they proffered against one another, that each was more interested in trade than in the welfare of the government. Notwithstanding the fact that the economic life of the colony depended on the Chinese trade, the evidence seems to indicate that, even this early in the history of the tribunal, its magistrates had personal interests to serve. In the letter referred to above, Davalos, who seems to have been a dissenting party to all these proceedings, charged his contemporaries with being guilty of undue mercantile activity. In this same memorial, the voidores warned the council against the Portuguese influence in China, deploring the existence of Macau as a rival to Manila as a trade emporium in the Orient. The audiencia warned the court against the influence and operations of Pedro Unamuno, the successor to Captain Gali, who had gone to China and Macau, supposedly to take on a cargo of Chinese silks. This was in defiance of the law which forbade Spaniards to trade in China, and it was also contrary to the instructions of the Viceroy and Audiencia of New Spain. In this connection, the voidores stated that they had recommended to Governor Santiago de Vera that Unamuno should be arrested and punished for diverting his voyage in the interests of private trade. In accordance with the advice of the tribunal, the governor had sent orders to Macau, summoning the leader of this expedition back to Manila. These instructions, however, the governor of Macau was unable to fulfill. 81. This memorial shows that the Theodores considered it to be their duty to inform the court fully as to the part which the Audiencia played in this affair. The matter at hand constituted a question of disobedience of the law, and the Audiencia of Manila had done what it could to enforce it. The tribunal had assumed a role play as important as that of the governor. The episode shows also that the Audiencia was consulted by the governor in this matter, which was purely governmental. It would not be unfair to suggest that a potential factor in stimulating the Theodores and merchants of Manila to prevent the voyage of Pedro Anaminu or the Portuguese to China for trading purposes must have been the desire to safeguard the Spanish interests in the Chinese trade, and particularly those of Manila, which were the sole reliance of the colony. It was essential that this commerce should be prevented from falling into the hands of other individuals or nations. This memorial also dealt with ecclesiastical affairs. In it was set forth the Audiencia's arguments and certain contentions which the tribunal had had with the bishop, illustrating the fact that the Audiencia was opposed not only by the governor but also by the ecclesiastical authorities. It appears that the king had formally granted to the church courts a large share of temporal jurisdiction in the islands. This former concession now stood in the way of the royal prerogative and caused endless conflicts between the civil and ecclesiastical judges. The Audiencia took the ground that by virtue of its own establishment the authority of the church courts over civil matters was at an end. This the prelate declined to admit. Attention was also directed by the Audiencia to the opposition which Bishop Salazar had manifested toward the claims advanced by the civil government for extending its jurisdiction over all the non-Christian tribes, the bishop alleging that Pope Alexander VI had ceded authority only over such Indians as had been Christianized. 82. In truth, the bishop had found after 2 years of conflict that the presence of the Audiencia had not entirely solved the problems of administration, but, on the contrary, had increased the complexity of many of them. He had differed seriously with the Theodores on several occasions. The ministers had opposed him not only in the larger questions of government and ecclesiastical administration, but in matters of ceremony as well. This was more than the prelate could endure. He appealed some of these disputes to the governor, and that official, after having neglected these matters for a long period, finally referred them to the Audiencia, which promptly made the settlements in its own favor. 83. Salazar's influence went far toward bringing about the removal of the tribunal, as it had helped in causing its establishment in 1584. The complaints of the bishop against the Audiencia brought forth a royal reprimand for carrying on continual disputes with the Audiencia. The prelate defended himself against these charges in a memorial dated June 24, 1590. 84, he stated that these petty matters of form and ceremony were of no great consequence. He accused the governor of seeking to stir up discord between him and the Audiencia. As a matter of fact, he said, the relations between him and the Audiencia were far more harmonious than they had been between the tribunal and the governor, and on many occasions he had been called in to settle disputes between the functionaries of the civil government. It is well known, he wrote, within the city and outside of it, that had I not entered as mediator between the president and Theodores there would have been no peace. It would not have been possible for me to mediate if there had not been friendly relations between him and me. 85. The unpopularity of the Audiencia from 1584 to 1586 is proved by the fact that practically all the authorities in Manila, mercantile, ecclesiastical, political, and even the magistrates themselves, united in recommending its recall. On June 26, 1586, a series of petitions was directed to the council from various personages and organizations of the city asking that the Audiencia be removed. These included the municipal cabildo, the bishop, the governor, certain military officials, and, lastly, several oidores, all, in fact, excepting Davalos. These greatly regretted the mistake which had been made in the establishment of the Audiencia, conceded that it had been a failure, and represented that the financial burden which its presence had imposed had been too great for the colony to bear. 86. It is certain that the continual conflicts which had resulted from the presence of the Audiencia had not produced a salutary effect on the government. The Audiencia itself wrote to the council at the same time. There has been in this tribunal, between the oidores and the president, continual misunderstandings as to jurisdiction, which we have decided to submit to your majesty to ascertain whether precedence in these matters belongs to the president or to the oidores. The Manila Cabildo recommended the re-establishment of the governorship with centralized authority, the power to grant titles, offices and encomiendas, with exclusive authority over the latter. This would include the power of appointing encomenderos in the name of the king. The recommendation was made by the Cabildo that consultative authority in matters of government should be conferred on the ecclesiastical and military officials. It was also suggested that a defender of the Indians should be appointed other than the fiscal, for the latter, by nature of his office, was their prosecutor rather than their defender. It was the current opinion, this memorial went on to state, that the local prelate should be restored to his former place as defender of the Indians, and that he should have authority to dispossess encomenderos, if necessity for such action arose. It has already been stated that Oidor Davalos was the only official of importance who would not join in these representations. He believed that the Audiencia was necessary to the prosperity of the colony, and that, if properly controlled, it would prove beneficial. He believed, moreover, that the governor was the chief element of discord in the colony, and that his influence had rendered inefficacious the efforts of the Audiencia to keep peace and to enforce the laws. In a letter to the king, 87, just a year before the memorial described above, Davalos had represented Governor Santiago de Vera as a schemer, aiming to get absolute control of the government. De Vera, he said, had gone so far as to influence the bishop and clergy to recommend, against their better judgment, the abolition of the Audiencia. The governor realized that the tribunal was the one obstacle in the way of the fulfillment of his designs and had used every possible means to discredit and humiliate the Audiencia and its magistrates. Davalos asserted that the appeal of cases to Mexico would inflict great inconvenience on the people of Manila. He renewed the argument that Spain should have some sovereign body at that great distance from the mother country. He enlarged on the future possibilities of the conquest and rule of the entire Orient by Spain, pointing out the value of the Philippines as a base of operations. It was, therefore, of the greatest importance that the island should be provided with the proper sort of government. Davalos was especially bitter in his denunciation of Governor de Vera, who, he said, had even resorted to force in order to intimidate the magistrates and had called the council of military officials on one occasion for consultation in matters of justice and government. The governor was accused of violating the laws which had forbidden officials to hold encomiendas. He had given the best posts in the government to relatives, and had completely set aside the judgments which Davalos had rendered in his capacity as Jus y Administrador de Bienes de Defuntos. The Audiencia had been powerless to oppose de Vera, largely, Davalos inferred, because a majority of the magistrates were under his influence. However unfavorable were the above comments on the governor, the picture which de Vera drew of himself in a letter to Archbishop Contreras, 88, at that time Viceroy of New Spain, is exceedingly interesting by way of contrast. In his own words, the governor had grown old and worn in His Majesty's service. According to him, the Audiencia was of no service to the government, and only a drawback, making his own duties as governor doubly heavy, especially since the Council of the Indies so poorly seconds my efforts. Everything concerning the government and war in these islands depends on the President. He must attend to everything punctually. And, in order to comply with His Majesty's commands, he must pay over and spend from the royal treasury what is necessary for the affairs of government and of war. He complained that the Audiencia had interfered with his administration of the finances and it suspended the payment of the drafts which he had drawn on the treasury. He had no recourse on account of the delay necessary before an appeal to the Council of the Indies could be answered. He complained that the Audiencia had meddled with affairs of government on trivial pretexts, rendering him practically powerless. During this period, the internal troubles of the colony were supplemented by the interference of the Viceroy and Audiencia in Mexico. The latter had been reluctant to surrender their former authority over the Philippines. There were conflicts of jurisdiction between the Viceroy and the Governor and between the two Audiencias over a number of matters, among which affairs of a commercial nature were preeminent. Both the authorities at Manila and those of Mexico claimed jurisdiction over the galleons which plied between Manila and Acapulco. 89. Numerous protests were made during this early period against what was considered the unauthorized interference of the Mexican authorities. Those in Manila felt that inasmuch as they had an Audiencia which was co-equal in power with that of New Spain, they should be independent of the Viceroyalty in all the affairs of justice, government, and commerce. The combined memorials of the residents and officials of Manila, which we have already noted, were presented at court by a new procurator, Fray Alonso Sanchez. The latter, a Jesuit, was a churchman of high standing, and his abilities were recognized both at Madrid and in Rome. Besides carrying commissions from the secular officials, he represented the bishop, but the latter, distrustful of the influence at court of a Jesuit commissioned by the secular government, with which the prelate was constantly at war, determined to send one of his own supporters to Spain to represent his interests. The emissary of Salazar was Fray Francisco Ortega of the Augustinian order. Ortega followed Sanchez to Spain and rendered valuable service as procurator of his order at Madrid. 90. In written memorials and in personal interviews with the king and with members of the Council of the Indies, Sanchez summarized all the arguments heretofore given, asking for the abolition of the Audiencia. The newness of the country, the sparseness of the population and the poverty of the inhabitants, according to his argument, made such an institution a financial burden. If it were continued, the salaries of the magistrates would have to be paid from Mexico. An Audiencia in Manila was not necessary, he urged, since the chief element of the population was military, and hence, under martial law and jurisdiction. Even before the establishment of the Audiencia, it had been necessary to send but few cases to Mexico. Indeed, alleged Sanchez, lawsuits seldom arose in the colony, and the presence of the Audiencia encouraged rather than prevented litigation among the few merchants who lived in Manila. The discord, caused by the presence of the tribunal and the continual lawsuits, which it encouraged among the Spaniards, had a disquieting effect on the natives, who had no need of such an institution, and who did not even understand its purposes. The Audiencia, instead of serving as a protection to the natives, was an instrument of tyranny. The Spaniards, understanding the use of a court which would enforce the contracts made between them and the ignorant Indians, were often supported in the seizure of the latter's property, which act, in reality, amounted to deprivation and legalized robbery. Sanchez stated that the natives had been terrorized by the Audiencia. The magistrates, versed in the legal customs and practices of Spain rather than of the Indians, were unfit to administer justice in the Philippines. Sanchez also emphasized the international phases of the Audiencia's existence in the Philippines, though with conclusions slightly different from those which we have already noted. He stated that the presence of the Audiencia had caused the Portuguese in China, formerly friendly, to be distrustful of the Spaniards, and this had resulted in a considerable diminution of trade. This change of attitude he attributed to the wording of the sigilla by which the tribunal had been created, extending its jurisdiction throughout the entire archipelago of China. Sanchez concluded his appeal with the statement that some act was necessary to restore the confidence of the Portuguese, whose influence, exerted upon the Chinese, could spell ruin for Spain's far eastern colony. The cancellation of that claim to China would remove all evidence of Spanish bad faith. It would show to the Portuguese that the Spaniards had no desire to encroach on their rights, and through the restoration of commerce and prosperity the future of the colony would be assured. 91. Sufficient has been presented to show that the Audiencia, as established in 1584, was not a success. The chief objection to the tribunal was not its influence as a court. The real fault seems to have lain in the indefiniteness of the Articles of Establishment, which gave it administrative powers, coordinate with the governor and captain general. Almost every difficulty occurred in the administrative field. The Audiencia also failed to preserve harmony between church and state and added to these complexities by itself having dissensions with the bishop. The petty character of the men who constituted this particular government, their personal selfishness, and their eagerness to take advantage, in dishonest ways, of the time and the distance which separated the colony from the royal control, contributed to the failure of the institution at that time. The Audiencia was scarcely established, and it certainly did not have time to adjust itself to the new conditions with which it found itself surrounded before it was removed. It would seem that the authorities in Madrid were somewhat hasty in withdrawing the Audiencia, for it had proved its efficacy throughout the entire Spanish Empire. The ill success of the Audiencia of Manila at this time does not prove that the institution was a failure, or that its establishment was a mistake. For 7 years later it was returned and continued without interruption until 1898, and continues still if then reorganized. The statement of Philip II on November 25, 1595, that experience had proved it to be unnecessary in a land so new and unsettled 92, can hardly be justified in view of subsequent events. The causes of the breakdown of the first Audiencia may be found in the circumstances of the time, the personnel of the tribunal, the indefiniteness of the laws which created it, the novelty of the situation to magistrates and officials and their failure to adapt themselves to their duties and to one another. As an institution of reform, the Audiencia did not have time to adjust itself to a permanent status. The king, in compliance with the demands of the various organizations and individuals of Manila as communicated by their respective envoys, abolished the Audiencia of Manila by royal sage law on August 9, 1589, ordering the Viceroy of New Spain to take the residences of all officials who had been identified with the Manila government. To carry out these orders, Licentiate Herver del Coro was sent from Mexico to Manila, where he arrived in May 1590, in company with the new governor, Gomez Perez das Marinas. 93. Santiago de Vera, the ex-governor, was promoted to a magistracy in the Audiencia of Mexico. The order, Pedro de Rojas, was made tenient and assessor to the governor, while the former order, Rivera, and Fiscal Ayala, were left without office. 94. The regular organization for the administration of justice in the provinces was left precisely as it had been when the tribunal was in existence. The alcaldes mayores and the corregidores still functioned as judges of first instance and as governors of the provinces. The alcaldes ordinarios remained the judges of first instance in the city of Manila. These judges tried cases with appeal to the governor, and the judgment of the latter was final in cases involving a value of 1,000 ducats or less. Cases of a higher category might be appealed from the decision of the governor to the Audiencia of Mexico, and thence, if again appealed, to the Council of the Indies. The Audiencia of 3 magistrates and a fiscal was replaced by a governor, who was both captain general and sole judge. He was assisted, in the latter capacity, as above noted, by a tenient and assessor, a lawyer, who advised him in legal affairs and prepared his judicial decisions for him. This reform was made on the representation of Fray Sanchez, that Manila had no need of a judicial system more pretentious than that of any Spanish provincial town. That city was accordingly reduced to the rank of a city or district, with dependence in judicial and administrative matters on New Spain, in whose Audiencia appeals from the governor of the Philippines were heard. With these new reforms, the leading authorities in Manila professed to be greatly pleased. Bishop Salazar, who was the most influential person in Manila at this time, expressed his satisfaction to the king in a letter dated June 24, 1590. 95, he suggested, however, that the continuance of the Audiencia might have been satisfactory could its members have been paid from the treasury of New Spain. He reported the arrival of a new governor and stated that the latter had already given evidence of a desire to govern wisely and justly. Salazar's optimism in regard to the good intentions of the governor could not have been long continued, for Morga tells us that in the first year of the government of Gómez Pérez Dasmariñas Benito, an audiencia was felt by many. 96. At that time, all the powers of government were centralized in the governor, and there was no immediate authority to which the people could apply for relief. Salazar had many disputes with the governor over questions relating to the respective spheres of the church and state, and from the decisions of the executive the prelate had no recourse. Dasmariñas, on reporting these matters to the king, stated that the bishop had interfered in the matter of the collection of the tribute, the government levy, and comiendas, the Chinese trade, in which the governor alleged that the prelate had an unpriestly interest and in the administration of justice. 97. The prelate had interpreted the removal of the audiencia as constituting a re-establishment of the concession formerly made to the church of extensive control in the administration of government and justice. He claimed that ecclesiastical judges should have the same civil jurisdiction as they had exercised before the audiencia was first founded. This, of course, the governor would not tolerate. Bishop Salazar was so displeased with the turn which affairs had taken in Manila that he determined to leave the islands, and passage being placed at his disposal by the willing governor, the bishop set out in July 1592. 98. On his arrival in Spain, Salazar concerned himself principally with religious matters, securing some valuable reforms. Among the latter was the erection of the Philippines into an archbishopric and the creation of 3 subordinate bishoprics. Salazar showed the desirability of the restoration of the audiencia as a preventive check on the excesses of the governor, but this change was not made as an immediate consequence of his recommendations. A cedula was issued on January 17, 1593, which outlined with more definiteness a judicial system for the islands. This reform confirmed the position of the governor as nominal head of the judiciary, with jurisdiction over appeals from the lower courts, but a decree that these cases should be tried by letrado. The governor's final and conclusive jurisdiction was extended to all cases not exceeding 1,000 ducats in value. Cases of a greater value might be appealed to the Audiencia of Mexico. 99. The governor was given authority to name a protector of the Indians. 100. The above changes were followed shortly by the cedula of August 18, 1593, by which the title of Teniente de Capitan General y Asesor de Gobernador y Capitan General de las Islas Filipinas was bestowed on Don Antonio de Morga, who was probably the most efficient jurist and one of the most versatile officials that Spain ever sent to her Asiatic dependency. 101. Morga was at this time not only successor to the Audiencia in judicial matters, but also Attorney General and sole legal advisor to the governor. His predecessor, Pedro de Rojas, was transferred to Mexico in pursuance of the idea, as alleged in the order of transfer, of removing from the Philippines all the members of the old Audiencia, so that the new scheme, as revised at that time, might be allowed to work itself out without prejudice. Before his departure, the residencia of Rojas was conducted by Morga. Even the reforms of 1593 did not suffice to make the administration of justice satisfactory to all parties. From the large amount of correspondence which exists, embodying complaints against the harsh methods of Dasmariñas and his successor, Tello, 3 letters may be cited which show the attitude of the various officials of the colony toward the re-establishment of the Audiencia. The first of these was written by Governor Dasmariñas himself, and it may be in some way surprising to note that he asked for the restoration of the Audiencia. His reasons, in part, however, were different from those advanced by his contemporaries. Dasmariñas was of the opinion that an Audiencia would be effective in the nullification of the interdicts and excommunications imposed by the Archbishop and the local prelate, which he claimed were working havoc with the civil government. 102. The Treasury officials complained that the absolute government of the executive was contrary to the interests of real hacienda. Their objections to the prevailing system were voiced in the second of the memorials alluded to above, that of Francisco de la Mesa, factor of the Royal Treasury of Manila. 103. Mesa said that under the former arrangement the Audiencia had audited the accounts of the Royal Treasury and of the City of Manila each year. In this way the accounts had been well kept and the funds properly accounted for. The removal of the Audiencia had left the governor with authority over the nomination of the officials of Real Hacienda, as well as the supervision of the accounts. Since Dasmariñas had been governor, no accounts had been rendered by the minor officials of the Treasury, and, as a consequence, their superiors had been unable to make up their reports for the Contaduría of Mexico. The governor's attention had been called to this deficiency repeatedly, but the latter had displayed no interest in the state of the colony's finances, which, said Mesa, exceeded all other matters in importance. This comes, the factor observed, from placing in charge of Your Majesty's finances a soldier, unfitted to do else than command troops, and then unchecked by an Audiencia so far distant from your royal person. The laxity of the governor and of his subordinates seems to have resulted in the loss of much revenue. Mesa also showed that there had been many irregularities in the sale of offices, deficiencies which the presence of an Audiencia would have checked. Instead of selling the minor clerkships of the exchequer, the governor had given them to his friends. 2 offices, which were by no means insignificant, those of the chief clerkships, of government and of justice, respectively, had been sold formerly for 4,000 pesos each. The governor, however, had preferred to have them on a civil patronage list. This would not have been permitted had an Audiencia been present to enforce the law. The governor was charged by Mesa with extravagance in the expenditure of the revenue of the colony. The payment of the salaries of new appointees to offices, friends of the governor, had made heavy drains on the treasury. The king, by repeated sigillas, had forbidden the designation of an excessive number of alcaldes and corregidors because of the desirability of economizing the resources of the colony. While the Audiencia was in existence, its consent had been necessary for the creation of new judicial districts, but since the recall of the tribunal, the governor had trebled the number of provincial officials and, in addition, had permitted each to have a salaried assistant. According to Mesa, various other evils had resulted from the absolutism of the governor, among which were numerous abuses which he had tolerated in the galleon trade. It was alleged that Spanish merchants in Mexico had sent money to agents in Manila, and in that way had caused the legal amount brought from Acapulco for investment on the annual galleon to be exceeded. 104. This, the factor stated, was due partially to the laxity and corruption of the Acapulco officials, who had permitted the galleon to leave that port with more than the authorized amount of money. The governor of the Philippines, however, could have prevented this abuse had he been so inclined, as the ship's manifests were always subject to his inspection on arrival at Manila. The money sent by the merchants of Mexico was invested in merchandise in the islands, and these goods were shipped back to Acapulco on the galleon, thus excluding the commerce of the local merchants. The latter were growing clear daily while the governor and his friends were waxing richer. The governor had also exercised favoritism in the distribution of cargo space, thus rewarding his friends and punishing his enemies. 105. Since the suppression of the Audiencia, these abuses had increased, as there had been no authority in Manila to hold the governor in check. This memorial, from Mesa, which was carefully considered at court, went far toward demonstrating that the restoration of the Audiencia would have beneficial results, so far as the administration of Real Hacienda was concerned. The third of the letters referred to as reflecting the attitude of the Manila officials toward the re-establishment of the Audiencia and ultimately contributing to its restoration, was directed to the court by Antonio de Morga, the efficient lieutenant governor. Morga, as did Mesa, placed great emphasis on the need in Manila of a more efficient system for the administration of the exchequer. Morga was moderate in his characterization of the governor, alleging that Dasmariñas had been brought completely under the influence of the ecclesiastics. He expressed the belief that an audiencia would aid in combating what he termed the retrogression of the colony under the influence of the priest. There should be someone, he wrote, to oppose the ecclesiastics in a land so far away from the audiencia of Mexico. 4. No matter what question is sent there for decision, at least 2 years must elapse before dispatches can be returned. 106. No official was better qualified to explain the needs of the colony in matters of justice than Morga, for he was at that time, in reality, the Supreme Court of the islands. The audiencia, after an interregnum of 7 years, was restored by a cedula promulgated by Philip II, November 26, 1595. 107. The tribunal was to consist of a president, who should also be governor and captain general, 4 oidores, a fiscal, and various subordinates. The history of the former audiencia and the reasons for its suppression and re-establishment are summarized in the cedula as follows. I established an audiencia in that city and province in order that everything might be governed by means of it, and that justice might be administered with the same universal equality, mildness, and satisfaction desirable. After its establishment I ordered it suppressed as experience proved it unnecessary in a land so new and unsettled. In its place I sent a governor, and though his administration was excellent, yet, inasmuch as that community had grown, and I hope that it will continue to grow, I have thought it advisable to found and establish the said audiencia again. In this cedula, which was addressed to Governor Tello, the king pointed to the increased importance of the Philippines, and to the many expeditions by which the island of Luzon and other islands of the archipelago had become pacified and more densely settled. The increase of commerce with the Chinese was also cited as a reason for providing the islands with a more stable government. It was stated that in the administration of justice there should be as much efficiency as possible without the loss and inconvenience involved in appealing cases to Mexico. The governor would have more time for his increasing administrative and military duties if disengaged from his former judicial functions. The cedula continued. You the governor may find it advisable to have by you persons with whom to take counsel, in order that matters may be considered with the requisite conformity and by a sufficiently large body of advisors. For these reasons I have decided to form an audiencia. You shall be its president, holding that office with those of my governor and captain general. 108. Together with this decree of re-establishment the king issued special instructions to Tello, prescribing in detail the relations which the governor was to observe with the audiencia. These instructions, in general, sought to prevent the recurrence of the misunderstandings which had been so fatal to the earlier tribunal. The governor and oidores were ordered to cooperate in the formulation of commercial regulations with a view, particularly, to securing the Chinese trade in the enforcement of the Pancada. 109. The consideration of ways and means to prevent money from passing to China in matters of taxation and finance and comiendas, and the pacification and government of the wild tribes. By these instructions, it is important to note, the function of advising the governor in administrative matters was definitely bestowed upon the oidores. Matters of importance, the cedula prescribed, the said president-governor shall discuss with the oidores of the said audiencia, so that the latter, after consultation, may give them their opinion. 110. The governor and the magistrates were jointly charged to do all possible to discourage Indians and Spaniards from wasting their means in fruitless and petty lawsuits. The natives, according to this new reglamento, should always be protected against the designs of those who would take undue advantage of them. The governor was, moreover, instructed to confer with the archbishop in audiencia in ecclesiastical affairs, and the prelates were especially forbidden to excommunicate and issue declamations from the pulpit against the officials of the civil government, such as were constantly proclaimed when Salazar was bishop. Priests were not to meddle with the civil government, or with the Pancada, or with any form of trade. The Audiencia as reformed, with the powers and duties noted, began its life in Manila on May 8, 1598. The inauguration of the tribunal was attended with general rejoicing, and a celebration characterized by great formality and pomp. The royal scene was conducted through the city in a procession which was composed of all the royal and clerical dignitaries. Church, state, and citizenry united in expressing satisfaction at the restoration of the tribunal, with its consequent prospect of an efficient government and administration of justice. Reforms were made in the scope and composition of the Audiencia at various times during its existence. It developed from a commission of 3 magistrates, with a president at its head, with definite and express powers over a vast archipelago, whose population was sparse and scattered, to a double-chamber tribunal of appeal, in second and third instance, with definite jurisdiction over a well-organized commonwealth. It would be highly desirable, did space allow, to review chronologically the important reforms which were made in the organization, scope and jurisdiction of the Audiencia of Manila throughout its history. The most important of these, however, will be noted incidentally in the following pages. The Audiencia, from the time of its renewal onward, typified and represented the royal authority, and its tenure was more continuous than the governorship. 8 times subsequently did the Audiencia assume the reins of government in lieu of the governor. It became the most reliable channel through which the royal authority made itself felt in the islands, and it was especially utilized by the court as a check on the governor. 111. Whenever occasion arose, the Audiencia interposed as the intermediary and arbiter between dissenting parties in the name of the sovereign, and its decrees were listened to with respect. It was no longer a temporary organization, and so firmly established was it henceforth that no person seriously considered its recall a possibility. Through a period of 300 years the Audiencia exercised its functions. It was first, and always a judicial body. It shared executive and administrative duties with the governor. It frequently exercised attributes of an advanced legislative character. It participated in the government of the provinces. It shared the authority of the royal patronage in the control of ecclesiastical affairs. These various activities will be studied in subsequent chapters. Chapter 3. The judicial functions of the Audiencia. The Audiencia was first and always a tribunal of justice. It was established for the purpose of trying cases and settling disputes. Had it no other functions than the purely judicial, however, it would not have played the important part which it did in colonial administration during 200 years of its existence. Its chief interest to the student of history and government will not be so much its activity as a judicial institution as the relations it bore to other departments of the government. Its extraordinary powers and functions developed, incidentally at first through the establishment of the institution in colonies where no other agency existed to deal with the unforeseen problems and necessities which arose from time to time. The gradual assumption and exercise of non-judicial functions are therefore the chief characteristics to be noted in the history of the Audiencia of Manila. The aim of this chapter, however, will be to study the Audiencia in its capacity as a civil judiciary and to clear the way for the discussion in subsequent chapters of the wider, and from the present viewpoint, more notable fields of its activity. An effort will be made to describe its judicial procedure, the kinds of cases which it tried, the limitations on its jurisdiction, what courts were inferior to it, and what authority was superior. This investigation will be made from the viewpoint of the historian, rather than from that of the student of jurisprudence, subject to such limitations as a lack of knowledge of the law may impose. We shall first consider the procedure of the Audiencia as authorized by the laws of the Indies, illustrating this procedure by the citation of actual cases in practice. The powers and duties of the Audiencia of Manila as defined in the special decree of establishment of May 5, 1583, have been set forth in the preceding chapter. By this decree the Audiencia was granted civil and criminal jurisdiction in cases of appeal from the lower courts and original jurisdiction in those affecting the government and the conduct of its officials. The authority of the Audiencia in the latter cases was exercised through the appeals which came to it from the special investigators and visitors who tried these officials in first instance. The laws of the Indies, after prescribing the time of meeting and the hours of the daily sessions of the Audiencia, made their first important judicial regulation by forbidding viceroys and presidents to assist in the determination of suits. Cases must be tried by the properly qualified oidores, yet the president, viceroy or governor was to sign the decisions with the magistrates. 112. Unless the president were a lawyer, he was even denied cognizance of military cases. The Audiencia had jurisdiction over appeals from the viceroy or governor in all government matters to which any official or private citizen might take exception. 113. In case of disagreement between the Audiencia and the president, it was prescribed that the question at issue should be carried to the Council of the Indies. In case the majority of the Audiencia agreed to follow a certain course of action, the viceroy or president was forbidden to contravene or oppose that action. Instead, he was ordered to abide by it, appealing to the Council of the Indies for final settlement of the contention. 114. There were many laws regulating the relations between the Audiencia and the governor, most of which will be noted in greater detail in a subsequent chapter. The most important were the laws which ordered that the viceroys of New Spain and Peru should leave to the Audiencia's entire jurisdiction over residentias, questions involving the marriage relation 115, and the administration of property of deceased persons. 116. A law especially referring to the Philippines ordered the Audiencia of Manila to abstain from interfering with the government of the Chinese in the Parian. 117. This did not forbid the trial on appeal of cases relating to the Chinese, since in practice, the Audiencia had authority to take cognizance of such cases. Certain extra duties were required of the oldest order of the Audiencia, who was known as the Decano. He was given complete authority over the tribunal in the absence of the president. He might assign cases to the magistrates, designate judges for special duties and determine all matters relating to the interior organization and government of the tribunal. These functions were assumed after 1776 by the regent, and the prerogatives of the office of Decano became merely nominal, except when the regent was absent. In audiencias whose size permitted it, the oldest order, or the regent, after that office was created, could determine whether sessions should consist of 1 or 2 salas. 118. An audiencia was legally constituted, however, if only one magistrate were present. 119. The audiencia was commanded to guard its proceedings with great secrecy, and such rules were formulated for its magistrates as would enable the tribunal to uphold its dignity and command the respect of the Commonwealth. Cases of first instance were tried by inferior judges who were below the category of oidores. 120. As noted in a former chapter, these judges were the alcaldes ordinarios, alcaldes mayores, and corregidores. The former tried civil and criminal cases in the towns and cities, and the last two exercised extensive jurisdiction in the provinces. Cases were appealed from them to the audiencia. 121. The audiencia was forbidden to concern itself with cases of first instance, excepting certain criminal suits which originated within 5 leagues of Manila. 122. A separate sala for the trial of criminal cases was created in the audiencias of Lima and Mexico. The magistrates serving in these salas were designated as alcaldes del crimen. They had jurisdiction in first instance over the criminal cases arising within 5 leagues of the capital, as referred to above, and in second instance over those appealed from the provincial judges. 123. The oidores in these audiencias confined themselves to civil suits, but in audiencias where there were no alcaldes del crimen, the oidores were authorized to try both civil and criminal cases. 124. The magistrates of the audiencia of Manila had both criminal and civil jurisdiction, as that tribunal belonged to the latter class. When the number of oidores present was insufficient to do the work of the audiencia, alcaldes ordinarios or alcaldes mayores who had the necessary qualifications might be transferred temporarily to the tribunal. When acting as oidores, they could not try cases over which they had formally exercised original jurisdiction. 125. A system of procedure was prescribed for the trial of cases before the audiencia and the order fixed in which these should come up for consideration. It was ordered that 2 slates should be kept, one for cases classified according to their importance and another for those to be tried by rotation. Cases of the first category and those which were especially urgent might supersede the latter, but when there were none of the former, the second slate was to be adhered to. Cases relating to real hacienda took precedence over all others. The President was instructed to see personally that these cases should not be subjected to delay and that at least 1 day a week should be set aside for their adjudication. Next in importance were cases involving infractions of royal ordinances and laws. Probate cases were given 1 day a week. 2 days weekly were set aside for the consideration of suits which arose between Indians and between Indians and Spaniards. Cases involving the poor, however, were to take precedence over these. The audiencia was made responsible for the good treatment of the Indians, and it was charged with the obligation of seeing that all suits to which Indians were parties should be tried without loss of time. Delays resulting from the carelessness of lawyers and from their eagerness to profit at the expense of the natives were discouraged. Matters of slight importance, which pertained to the Indians, were to be dispatched by decrees of the audiencias and viceroys. This provision was designed to avoid contentious litigation, to which the natives were characteristically inclined. It also sought thereby to protect them from dishonest judges and lawyers. Any and all of the cases mentioned in this paragraph were considered to be of such importance that they were classified among the first to be tried and determined prior to those involving property, commercial affairs, and ordinary transactions. Of the latter cases, those already decided were to be reopened before the hearing of new cases of the same class. Cases involving the poor were to be given speedy consideration. 126. Length of waiting should be the criterion for the consideration of the remaining cases. The audiencia was empowered to compel testimony from all persons and authorities. 127. As already noted, the oidores of audiencias which did not contain alcaldes del crimen were authorized to entertain appeals from persons who had been condemned to death. 128. The same was true of all other criminal cases that were admitted to appeal. Members of religious and military orders were not exempted from the jurisdiction of the audiencia. 129. The laws regulating the audiencia's jurisdiction in civil cases seem to have varied according to the time and the policy of the government. The audiencia exercised both original and appellate jurisdiction, as we have already noted. Most of the civil suits tried by the tribunal were appealed to it from inferior judges. A law was made in 1563 ordering that cases involving less than 20 pesos might be tried by verbal process. 130. This law would seem to have excluded cases of less than that value from appeal to the audiencia, as the processes had to be committed to writing in order to be appealed. The cedullas of November 26, 1573, and August 10, 1574, fixed the minimum amount that might be appealed at 6 pesos of 8 reals, or 3,000 maravedis. 131. Charles V in 1542 promulgated an important law for the regulation of appeals to the audiencia. It provided that the smallest amount that might be appealed should be 300,000 maravedis, 667 pesos. 132. This law was repromulgated on September 24, 1568, and on September 22, 1626. 133. The provisions of these laws, however, probably applied only to such cases as might come from provincial justices, since appeals from city judges and ayuntamientos could be taken over by the audiencia with less trouble and expense, because of the proximity of the tribunal. As a matter of fact, this opinion is seemingly substantiated by a new law, dated June 13, 1634, which ordered that an appeal from an ayuntamiento should not be received in an audiencia unless the suit involved a sum greater than 60,000 maravedis, or 133 pesos. 134. This was considerably less, it will be seen, than the amount fixed as the limit by the law immediately preceding it, which was promulgated in 1626. The laws establishing the finality of the jurisdiction of the audiencia were also altered from time to time. The earliest law on the subject, dated April 24, 1545, ordered that no appeal should be made from the tribunal in cases involving less than 6,000 maravedis, 13.3 pesos. 135. This limit was raised to 200 pesos by sigillus of April 4, 1558, and March 4, 1559, and by the Ordinance of 1563. 136. In 1542, the jurisdiction of the audiencia was made final in all cases appealed from the ordinary courts. 137. The execution of all decisions which were not appealable was rigidly required. 138. By the Ordinance of 1563 it was stipulated that sentences of review which had been confirmed by the audiencia could not be appealed again, no matter how large a sum was involved. 139. This was partially abrogated by the law of February 13, 1620, which ordered that cases involving 6,000 pesos of 450 maravedis each, already terminated on review by an audiencia, might be further appealed to the king. 140. Decisions were reached by the concurrence of a majority of the magistrates trying the case. When there were only 2 oidores present, a decision had to be unanimous. In case the full quota of magistrates were present and the votes were equally divided, the fiscal might be called in to decide the case, but if the latter were prosecuting the case, or were otherwise incapacitated, a duly qualified lawyer might be chosen to serve as a special magistrate. 141. This rule did not apply to the revision of sentences in civil cases wherein the value exceeded 300,000 maravedis. In these the concurrence of 3 magistrates was necessary. 142. A record of the judicial decisions of the magistrates was kept in the official journal of the audiencia. Decisions in legal papers had to be signed by the magistrates involved. Oidores who registered dissenting opinions were obliged to affix their signatures to the autos with those who had voted in the affirmative, but the negative votes were also recorded. 143. While the audiencia might repeal the written opinion of an inferior judge in review of sentence, the revision of verbal decisions of alcaldes ordinarios could be accomplished only when the alcalde in question had been summoned before the tribunal and the reasons for his decision had been investigated in his presence. 144. The audiencia, therefore, exercised appellate jurisdiction over civil and criminal cases tried in first instance by the judges of the provinces. If an alcalde mayor or other inferior judge failed to comply with the instructions laid down for his guidance, or if he were guilty of an abuse in the administration of justice, he was held to account by the visiting order who was dispatched at regular intervals for the inspection of the provinces and for the judicial scrutiny of the provincial courts. In cases of notorious injustice, special pesquisidores, usually oidores, were sent at once for the correction of the abuse in question, at the expense of the offending officials. 145. These, if found guilty of willful disobedience, were punished in accordance with the gravity of their offenses. The audiencia had appellate jurisdiction in these cases. 146. The visiting oidores imposed fines in accordance with a tariff which had been formulated by the audiencia and approved by the Council of the Indies. 147. All fines levied by the audiencia either upon officials or individuals could be remitted by the president with the consent of the equito. 148. It was the policy of the government to give the audiencia final jurisdiction in as many cases as possible. It was desirable to endow the colonial tribunals and authorities with sufficient power to make them worthy of respect. At the same time, it was necessary to relieve the Council of the Indies of the duty of hearing the vast number of individual suits which would inevitably come to it if that tribunal were made too accessible. The council was occupied with appeals in government and justice from all of Spain's colonies. It has been noted that the limit of value of cases which could be appealed from the Audiencia to the Council of the Indies was raised in 1620 from 200 pesos to 6,000 pesos. This would seem to indicate a growing tendency to confine suits involving individuals to the colonial tribunals, thus increasing the importance of the audiencias, and at the same time making the Council of the Indies more exclusively a tribunal of administration. This change, however, was never completely effected, despite the various expedients adopted to discourage the appeal of individual cases. Persons appealing were obliged to guarantee the expenses of suit. The great cost, the delays, and the distance altogether made appeal difficult. Appeals of longer standing than 2 years were not received from the Philippines and the Council of the Indies. 149. An investigation of the records shows that most of the cases appealed to the Council of the Indies involved administrative law, in some form, having to do either with the prosecution of officials, their removal from office, the prosecution of bondsmen, residentias, conflicts of jurisdiction, or with appeals from the decision of the Audiencia in commercial and ecclesiastical matters. The gradual extension of the jurisdiction of the Audiencia over encomiendas may be cited as an example of the changes in the authority of the tribunal and in its relation to the Council of the Indies. The first important legislation in regulation of the encomienda was the celebrated Law of Moline, promulgated in that city by Charles V. on October 20, 1545, and enunciated at successive dates until 1610. The law prescribed the course which was to be pursued by the Audiencia in suits between individuals relative to encomiendas or the Indians thereon. In these contentions, the Council of the Indies and not the Audiencia was the final arbiter. The duty of the latter tribunal was to collect evidence in these cases, taking the testimony of witnesses for both sides and remitting all papers, sealed, to the Council of the Indies. The Council, on consideration of the evidence, rendered the final decision. The Audiencia had to conclude its part of the investigation and file its report within a period of 3 months. This time limit was extended to 6 months in 1554. The purpose of this law was to guarantee justice in the assignment and retention of encomiendas by removing them from the control of the audiencias, whose magistrates, as experience had proved, often allowed themselves to be influenced by local prejudices. Encomiendas were to be assigned by the king, in theory at least, and no other authority save the monarch and his council could exercise jurisdiction over them. 150. The Audiencia was, however, authorized to act as the protector of persons holding Indians on encomiendas, to see that they were not unjustly deprived of or wrongfully disturbed in their holdings. In case a person were thus deprived of his Indians, the Audiencia was empowered to restore conditions to their former state. If the aggressor persisted or cared to contest the right of his opponent to the Indians in question, the Audiencia was ordered to observe the law of Moline, collecting all the evidence in the case and forwarding it to the Council of the Indies for final decision. The frequency of litigation, however, and the vast number of unimportant cases which arose under the provisions of the law of Moline came to demand too much of the time and attention of the Council of the Indies, thereby causing many delays in suits involving encomiendas. In order to remedy this defect, Philip III, on April 17, 1609, conferred on the Audiencia jurisdiction over all cases involving encomiendas, repartimientos, 151, tributes, and despoliations of Indians up to the value of 1,000 ducats. 152. Cases involving a greater value were still to be settled in conformity with the law of Moline. Finally, in 1624, it was ordered that in suits which did not involve more than 3 Indians and in cases wherein the costs of litigation exceeded the amount in dispute, the decree of the governor should prevail. For obvious reasons, the Audiencia could not concern itself with such cases, but when the value of the Indians justified the attention of the tribunal, its decisions were final, taking precedence over those of the governor. 153. This Then, was the final status of the jurisdiction of the Audiencia over encomiendas as set forth in the laws of the Indies. In the Philippines, the authority of the tribunal in regard to them was neither executive nor legislative, except in such cases and on such occasions as we shall refer to later. The judicial authority of the Audiencia of Manila over encomiendas was indisputable. Having indicated the general basis upon which the authority of the Audiencia rested, we may more precisely define its jurisdiction by reviewing a few of the most characteristic cases which were tried in the tribunal in accordance with the laws already discussed. The statement has been made that at the time of its establishment the Audiencia was needed as a court of justice and that it was removed in 1589 for political reasons rather than because of the inadequacy or failure of the institution as a tribunal of justice. In the preceding chapter we saw that the Audiencia was designed to relieve the executive of judicial duties, such as the trial of cases appealed from the alcaldes mayores of the provinces and the alcaldes ordinarios of the city. These functions, up to the time of the establishment of the Audiencia, had been exercised by the governor. This had resulted in favoritism and in a perversion of justice to the private ends of the governor and of his friends. Perhaps the chief evil under the system had proceeded from the governor's double jurisdiction, as both executive and judge, over cases involving encomiendas and encomendas. The governor assigned encomiendas in the name of the king, and he was also judged with final jurisdiction over all suits involving them, the law of Ning being impossible of execution in the Philippines before the establishment of the Audiencia and after its withdrawal in 1589. 154. The same was true in regard to commercial cases and complaints wherever arising against the governor's high-handed proceedings in the allotment of cargo space on the galleons to his friends and his monopolization of the best Chinese goods that came to Manila. The governor, as in the assignment of encomiendas, enjoyed an undue advantage in these matters, for at the same time that he was the executive with the power of bestowing these favors, he was the sole judge in all contentions which arose regarding commerce. It was therefore distinctly in the interests of justice that a Supreme Court should be established, and it is easy to understand why those who had profited by the absence of the Audiencia should oppose its restoration, and why others should take the opposite view. Soon after the Audiencia was abolished in 1589, arguments were presented at court for its restoration. From the large number of petitions that were presented, two, aside from those discussed in the preceding chapter, may be cited here because they illustrate the disadvantages from a judicial point of view of having the administration of justice in the hands of the governor, with appeal to Mexico. Francisco de la Mesa, Factor of the Treasury of Manila, wrote a memorial to the king on May 31st, 1595, 155, referring to the delay which had arisen in the trial of suits involving encomiendas. The jurisdiction of the governor was not final. Appeals had to be carried to the Audiencia of Mexico in cases involving 1,000 ducats or more had to be taken from that tribunal to the Council of the Indies. 156 is met to appeals and much delay. He mentioned certain cases which have been pending 2 years, and show that, because of the delay to which they had been subjected in Mexico, it would be at least 2 years more before the decisions could be returned. Mesa said that conditions had reverted to the state which had existed before the Audiencia was established. A much larger number of cases was awaiting trial than the governor and his lieutenant could attempt to try. These difficulties were multiplied by the fact that there was no fiscal, an officer whose services as legal advisor to the government and as prosecuting attorney were indispensable. 157. Mesa petitioned for a reform of the law which had established the governor as judge of ultimate recourse in cases involving 1,000 pesos, ducats, or less. He believed it advisable to reduce the limit of the value of cases settled in the colony from 1,000 to 400 pesos and appeal all those exceeding the latter sum to the Audiencia of Mexico. It would result in a more equitable administration of justice, he stated, if the trial of important cases were conducted in second instance before that tribunal. This practice, though subject to great delay, would have the advantage of guaranteeing the review of these cases by a competent and properly qualified magistracy, rather than by a biased and tyrannical executive. He alleged that 400 pesos in the Philippines meant as much as 1,000 elsewhere. Another suggestion advanced by Misa was that suits and investigations involving real hacienda should be tried by competent judges, rather than by the governor, whose own personal interest in the cases was often too great to ensure fair trial. Another evil pointed out by Misa, and a fairly typical one throughout the history of the colony, was the delay and uncertainty of the residencia. This defect was particularly apparent at this time because all cases of residencia had to be sent to Mexico, since there was no tribunal in Manila with jurisdiction on appeal over these official investigations. Misa described the plight of various alcaldes, mayors, corregidors, and other officials who had been investigated and suspended from office, awaiting the outcome of the residencia. There were no persons to take their places. As a result, the suspended officials were without gainful employment, while their districts and offices reverted to a state of lawlessness, barbarism, and disorder, without governor, judges, or incumbents. The governor had attempted to remedy the trouble by making temporary appointments from among the removed officials, but this he had no authority to do. Moreover, the reinstatement of officials whose conduct was under investigation was subversive of the best interests of government and justice. The governor's action in these cases had raised a storm of protest in the colony, yet he was forced to take these steps in preference to leaving the natives without government and protection. Misa presented this picture of the state of affairs in the colony to show the evil results of the absence from the Philippines of a tribunal with authority to conduct residencias and to provide offices. While the series of complaints was not followed by an open advocacy of the establishment of a rural audiencia in Manila, the defects, which were pointed out, showed the desirability of putting an end to the governor's intervention in judicial matters. There can be no question but that the arrival at court of such letters showed clearly the need of a tribunal at Manila for the administration of justice. Complaints were also directed against the state of affairs by Antonio de Morga, Lieutenant Governor of the islands. This official argued that the Commonwealth required an audiencia in order to secure a more equitable administration of justice. 158, he called attention to the overcrowded docket of the court over which he presided and emphasized the impossibility of the satisfactory termination of the cases waiting to be tried. That the defects referred to in these communications were appreciated at court is evidenced by the settlement of May 26, 1595, which emphasized the necessity of administering justice in the Philippines with universal equality, mildness, and satisfaction. 159. Nevertheless, the presence of a tribunal had the effect of encouraging the inhabitants of the islands to litigation. It has been said that there have been more lawsuits in the Philippines than in any other country of the same size and population, which remark probably would apply to any country where the Spanish judicial system had lately attained. This condition was no doubt due to the fact that adequate facilities existed whereby the natives could go to law. Lawyers and judges were ever unduly ready to encourage and hear any suits which might arise if there were any way in which profit might be derived therefrom. Pardo de Tavera, in discussing these phases of the legal history of the island, states that the laws protected the native, but at the same time they kept him in a state of perpetual tutelage. Judgments were passed by native magistrates in suits between natives in the later days of Spanish rule, but in general, throughout the period of Spain's domination, suits were prosecuted under the direction of a protector of the Indians in case one party to a suit was a Spaniard, or when the rights of the natives were in any way jeopardized or injured by a Spaniard. In this manner, Spanish prestige was preserved, inasmuch as it was no longer an Indian who asked for the punishment of one belonging to a superior race, but a Spaniard who took up the Indian's cause and conducted a suit against another Spaniard. 160. Thus it may be seen that in Spain's judicial system the means were provided, in theory at least, whereby the meanest native could obtain justice, not only among his fellows, but in cases to which members of the superior Spanish race were parties. The declared purpose of the whole system of legislation for the Indies was the material and spiritual well-being of the Indians. 161. The officials of the government, the churchmen, and the encomenderos were especially charged in the commissions and in official correspondence to make the protection and welfare of the Indians their chief concern. Attention has just been directed to the office of Protector of the Indians. The fiscal, or one of his assistants, attended to that duty in the Audiencia of Manila, while agents, agentes fiscales, were especially commissioned by the fiscal to act in that capacity in the provinces. 162. We have also noted that the oidores were charged with the duty of protecting the Indians when officiating as visitors in the provinces. Such cases, also those involving decisions of corregidors and alcaldes mayores by which the natives were dealt with unjustly, were appealable, under certain circumstances, to the Audiencia. These cases commanded the immediate attention of the tribunal, to the exclusion of other business. 163. Among the vast number of cases at our disposal which illustrate the jurisdiction of the tribunal over such matters, the following may be selected as typical. On May 16, 1796, the fiscal brought a charge in the Audiencia against the governor, exposing the sufferings inflicted upon the Indians of the area of Santa Ana by the corregidor of Tondo. 164. In connection with the construction of a road. The Audiencia refused to consider the case in first instance, as the matter was not contentious, but it recommended that the fiscal should make the charges before the governor and have him render a decision upon the matter. If exception were taken to his decision, the case could be appealed to the Audiencia. The oidores found that they were without jurisdiction over the case in first instance, and they declared that their entertainment of the suit would be in violation of the laws of the Indies. 165. The fiscal appealed from the judgment of the Audiencia. The Council of the Indies, in a return communication dated May 13, 1798, 166, approved the ruling of the Audiencia, affirming that in cases of the nature referred to, the fiscal, as protector of the Indians, should submit testimony in behalf of the latter to the governor, who should consider whether the Indians had been wronged and render his decision accordingly. If exception were taken to the decision of the governor, the case could then be appealed to the Audiencia. While these appeals and this litigation were in progress, the Indians were being subjected to repeated hardships. This case is illustrative of the ineffectiveness of the system for the administration of justice in Spain's colonies. It had taken 2 years for this appeal to be carried to Spain and receive the attention of the Council of the Indies. The answer had yet to be returned, probably requiring at least a year more for the return of the Veracruz and Acapulco galleons and for the proper proceedings to be carried on in the Manila Tribunal. It is questionable whether the Indians in whose interests this was ultimately done ever received any benefit from these legal proceedings. The case which has just been described involved the trial and punishment of a corregidor in the defense and protection of the natives. It is important to note that this case was ordered to be tried in first instance by the governor and not by the Audiencia. The jurisdiction of the latter tribunal in second instance was confirmed by the king on this occasion. By the law of October 9, 1812, and by others made pursuant to the Constitution of 1812, the Audiencia was given jurisdiction in first instance over cases involving provincial officials, and particularly judges. In regard to the care and protection of the Indians, which was involved in this controversy, the law provided that such cases should be treated originally by the corregidors and alcaldes mayores with appeal to the Audiencia. 167. But this case dealt primarily with the official conduct of the corregidor, over whom the governor had more direct jurisdiction. The Sigilla of May 13, 1798, which constituted the reply of the king to the appeal of the fiscal in the case described above, ordered that, henceforth in cases affecting the relations of the corregidors and alcaldes mayores on the one part and the Indians on the other, the fiscal